We'll begin in a few minutes. Please begin to head to your seats. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our Standing Advisory Group meeting. And thanks again for all the work yesterday. In the breakout sessions that I participated in, everybody worked very hard, gave us a lot of valuable input, and as you'll see from our agenda today, there are sessions at 9:45 to get feedback, get the report back on the meeting on the board's general reports, and at 11 o'clock, report back on the audit quality indicators. But first thing this morning, board members Jay Hansen and Jeanette Franzel will lead a discussion with respect to another major board priority, and that is improving our outreach with audit committees about PCAOB activities. So Jay?
Thanks, Marty, and welcome back, everybody. This is a really important initiative that we have going on relative to our outreach to audit committees. As we've talked about several times over the last day, we've got a handful of near-term board priorities, and one of them is increase our outreach to audit committees, and that's somewhat of an overarching statement about virtually all the board initiatives, because a lot of them are about transparency and communication and improving audit quality by letting essentially market forces help us with that goal of improving the audit quality. So today's discussion on how we can best do outreach to audit committees is somewhat bridging a lot of these priorities, including some of the discussion from yesterday. Another point to make is that in 2011 we issued the concept release on independence, objectivity, professional skepticism, and a lot of the feedback in that from the 600 plus comment letters talked about audit committee role and whether that could be enhanced, whether we could do things to enhance that, and so this is consistent with the feedback that we've received there. In the past year, we've also had some pretty substantive interaction with some audit committee chairs from very large companies and really had some good, robust, fairly one-on-one type discussions, bringing in small groups to talk to the board, and got some good ideas about things that they thought were important. And so this is really a chance to build on some of that discussion about what they thought was important, and more importantly, focus on how we're going to get this done, because we've got a myriad of things that we could possibly do, and we need to really focus on where's the best place to put our resources in the near term. And we recognize that we've not in the past had a lot of regular interaction with audit committees. The briefing paper talked about some of the things we've done in the past, and we'll be curious to hear your views on that. But this is really the launching point for what more we're going to do in the future. So our goal is that Jeanette and I are going to talk very little and listen a lot. And so Jeanette's going to talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish today. Jeanette?
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to back up one slide here. The views expressed by each of us are our own and not necessarily those of the PCAOB members of the board or the PCAOB staff. Now we're in the clear. As Jay mentioned, we've had some interactions with audit committees. It's not been systemic. Audit committees play a very key role in this whole system of achieving high-quality independent audits, and we want to be sure that we're working together constructively and in a collaborative manner, because we've really got mutual goals and interests with audit committees. Having said that, because we haven't had a systematic approach, everything's on the table. I mean, we are battling with issues like, how do we even get the contact list of audit committee chairs? Should we have small group meetings, large group meetings, one-on-one meetings, or all of the above? Should we do some kind of regular event? Should we do mailings out to audit committee members? So this is a brainstorming session, and I encourage everybody to be very creative, because this will help us form various initiatives going forward. And all, of course, with the goal of helping to achieve independent, high-quality audits, because we all have our part to play in this. So with that, I want to talk about some of the potential objectives that we have thought about relating to this project, and if you all have feedback on additional objectives or on these objectives, we certainly want to hear about that today. So one of the objectives is to really help audit committees understand audit inspection findings, and we talked yesterday about how maybe we can make those findings more understandable or do additional communications there. So some of our initiatives are really going to work together to help achieve these goals, but in today's session, it's really what mechanisms can we use to communicate with audit committees to help them better use and understand our inspection findings. Another potential goal is to really work together with audit committees on an ongoing basis to help give them information to help evaluate independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism of their auditors. Again, it's a mutual goal, and we're all working toward improvements and high quality in those areas. Also focusing on relevant and emerging audit risks and issues, things that we're seeing and maybe things that audit committees are seeing, so that we can all work with that on a proactive basis rather than an after-the-fact basis, and be more timely in our mutual responses. Item D there is providing a mechanism for feedback to the board from audit committees on the effectiveness of the board's regulatory activities, including inspections and standard setting. And I will say that the feedback that we've been able to get from audit committees, again, just on sort of an individual basis, has been extremely valuable and eye-opening to us. We have heard of cases where auditors are interpreting SEC activities in a certain manner that was not intended. And so it's interesting how it has trickled all the way down to the audit committee and to the auditor behavior. And we certainly want a way to know if that is happening so that we can correct that mid-course. We're also interested, of course, in hearing from audit committees on audit quality indicators and what kinds of information can we provide to audit committees. And we had that discussion yesterday, and we'll have a session on that today. And then just finding ways to collaborate and communicate on an ongoing basis. So rather than taking the piecemeal approach that we have in the past, to really put in place some kind of a regular ongoing mechanism for communication, so that as emerging issues come up or as we have new results, we've got mechanisms in place to capture that. So what we hope to accomplish today is really get creative thinking and feedback from all of you. The way we're going to do this is we're going to just go through questions several at a time, because I think to go through them one at a time would be a little bit burdensome, but you don't feel like you have to stay tied to an individual question. If you've got the floor and you've got some good ideas, we want to hear about them. And we want everybody to participate. We are going to, though, reserve a little time at the end and have all of the audit committee members put their tent cards up and give us any last words or thoughts they have after the end of the session. So with that, we'll go ahead with the first couple of questions, and we'll just go through a couple of them and then we'll open it up. And I think we're going to take a poll as well. So we'll do that in just a moment. So really the first is, do you agree with those objectives that I just explained? Are there others? Are there some that you think are extra important, and so on? And given what we've done in the past, what have you found valuable in terms of past communications and so on that would be helpful for audit committees, and how do you think that these can be enhanced? And then finally, what would be potential approaches? So really, in this segment, we want to talk about the objectives, what kind of feedback you might have on our prior efforts, and what type of potential approaches do you think might be appropriate. But before we jump into that, I think we want a show of hands, just directionally, if you agree that this is an area that we should pursue and put our resources into communications with audit committees. If you're directionally in agreement with this, we want to see a show of hands. So, okay, terrific. We want to hear from all of you. And if anybody didn't raise your hand, we want to hear about why. So let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, Wally Cooney?
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic. I think the base level knowledge of audit committees is overall pretty low. I know there has been a lot of outreach, and there are certain audit committee members that are familiar with what you've done and you've had meetings with them. But I think overall, we're really starting from a relatively limited base of knowledge about what the PCAOB does and their role. I don't think they really understand the dynamics of the standard setting, how the inspection process works, and I think we're starting from a low level. One of the topics that I thought would be helpful, and it came out of the discussions yesterday, was giving them an understanding of what an audit failure, what an audit failure is, how it came about, because I still think there's a prevailing idea that an audit failure would generally relate to a restatement. And obviously, there's a lot of audit failures that have to do with a lot of other issues. So I think that's a topic that really should be addressed in an educational way. Overall, I think the one-on-one meetings that you've conducted, from what I understand, have really been effective. And I think, people who've participated in those meetings really come out with a much different idea of what the PCAOB does, what their role is. I think one of the other avenues that I personally have participated in is KPMG has an audit committee series. They get a really good attendance there, and I think that would be a really good forum for board members and other members of PCAOB staff to get into those meetings and participate as presenters.
John White?
I guess just as a general point, I think this is a very important and very good direction for the PCAOB to be moving, and I like what you're doing here. Just to observe first, what the report you did in August, I think, is basically right on in terms of how you ought to be setting up communications. I mean, I like the way it was structured. I like the summary up front. I like the ability to drill down on the questions. I like basically giving an audit committee, I'm going to call it actionable information. It's a very useful tool to use when you're talking with audit committees. It allows audit committees to, something they can actually use. If I was just, kind of thinking about, and some of these thoughts came from listening to the discussion yesterday, but just a couple of suggestions. One, I think you want to start with writing really good stuff. And by that, I mean you've done one of them, but that's the kind of thing you should write that has your views in it and with actionable ideas. And then second, you need to avoid overload. Two a year would be fine. But you need things that are focused on audit committees, but, don't try to do too many. Get really focused ones that are good, like you've done, and plan just, one or two a year. And then in terms of getting it out there, your one-on-one communications is a great way to do it. One-on-one communications is, I think, the effective way to get it out there. But you're not going to be able to do it all yourself. But there are a lot of other mediums that are out there. Whether it's the NACD or their educational programs, or there are a whole bunch of different consultants to audit committees, lawyers, other consultants. But if you've given people this document that expresses your views, it's not a problem that, they may give their gloss on it, but your view's there and your actionable ideas. And don't forget, of course, the one group that is always before your audit committee are the auditors themselves. So you've got, leveraging and having the auditors convey the information is a very effective way, because you reach every audit committee that way. But again, the key is to write something really good yourself, and it's okay for other people to then hand it out and add their gloss to it.
Scott Showalter?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with all the previous commenters as well about how important this is. As to another objective, I suggest if you look through there and build on our conversation yesterday, I think one of the objectives was to help the audit committees understand their role in audit quality. I think that's missing from your objectives. As a matter of fact, if you look at the second one, it talks about trying to help understand the independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism of the auditors, but you can turn that around and say, how could the audit committee help the auditor with their independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism? I think there's a good role, a good give and take there. So I would add another objective there. I think that ties in for our whole audit quality conversation yesterday and understanding how that works. As to the materials, I agree with John's comments. I don't think it needs to be a whole lot, but I would write them from the perspective of an audit committee, which means I don't need a lot of technical footnotes. But they just don't assume because you say it, they'll get it. There is a diverse variety of quality of audit committee members, and I think you ought to don't always remember the top group. I think you have to shoot more for the middle group and the bottom group. That's the group you're trying to really communicate with, I think, on this area. So but I'd write it from their perspective, and I'd also agree you don't have to come up with your own mailing list. There's a lot of organizations that have that. You just need to tap into it. I do understand there's probably some sensitivities working through KPMG's ACI, but you do have NACD and you have other organizations out there that I think have that list you're looking for that you don't have to maintain. But I'm very supportive of what you're doing here. Thank you.
We have Lisa Roth on the phone. Lisa Roth? All right, we'll try to hook her in later. Roman Weil?
I'm probably going to flog a dagged horse here, and I want to go back to the top of what you're doing. Marty has schooled me in the notion that what I'm about to read to you is now obsolete. But let me tell you that in the year 2004, the PCAOB said, with respect to what an auditor is supposed to do, the auditor is supposed to assess the effectiveness of the audit committee. Ineffective oversight by the audit committee should be regarded as at least a significant deficiency and should be an indicator, or maybe an indicator that material weakness exists. Looked like we were going in the direction of saying the PCAOB is going to make sure those audit committee people meet the listing requirements of the stock exchanges and are financially literate. Now that's gone away. And when I listen to the underlying theme here, it's audit committees are weak, we wish they were better, we have to pitch to the middle or the lowest denominator in there to teach them to be better. I'm not getting out of this effort, let's figure out how to make audit committees stronger so that we don't have to tell them about us. I cannot imagine that you would be a competent audit committee and not know about the PCAOB and that it makes these reports available. So here I'm listening to you saying we're accepting the incompetence of audit committees as is and we're going to pitch to that level. I'm not hearing we're going to do what we can, if anything, and maybe it's nothing, to have auditors report on the failures of audit committees to be sufficiently savvy that we don't need to pitch to this lowest common denominator. So I'm perhaps off base, flogging this dead horse, but I'd like to see the PCAOB doing what it can to get those levels higher by getting auditors to report. These people aren't very good. Now recognize the problem with that is we say that the main job of the audit committee is to hire the auditor. And here I'm saying the auditor needs to report to somebody, the board, if not the audit committee. Your audit committee is incompetent, is not financially literate. So I said, maybe it's the dead horse. This all went away 8 years ago and we can't do it. But I don't like the notion that we start from a premise that we audit committee members, which is what I am, are mediocre and we got to pitch education to that level.
I'll just make one brief comment, if I may, and that was auditors are still responsible for reporting material weaknesses if the audit committee is not functioning in their oversight role of the financial reporting. And if that rises to a level of a material weakness, an auditor still has that responsibility. I'm sorry if I said audit committee. An auditor still has that responsibility. So I think what you were reading from was the release pertaining to AS2, and that was superseded by AS5, and some of that language was changed. But But still, there is a responsibility to evaluate by the auditor internal controls, and if there's a weakness in the internal controls, including lack of audit committee oversight over the financial reporting role, that would still be reported. But having said that, I think what we're talking about here is, in addition to that responsibility that auditors have, there are many good ways in which the PCAOB should coordinate with audit committees, and I think both things can coexist. Jeanette, I think you were going to comment further as well.
No, you did a very good job there, Marty, so I have no further comments. Harrison Green.
I think that over the years, and what we've seen is that I think it's a continuing education process regarding audit committees, and I think we're on the right road. But my one suggestion or actually two, would be maybe for the PCAOB to put out a paper on what its expectations are as far as the responsibilities of audit committees with the external auditor, and also their responsibilities regarding their interaction and oversight of the internal audit function. Because I think those two are really interrelated. And I think that would really help audit committees, at least if there's a document out there and saying, here's what our expectations are regarding those responsibilities. They have a lot of responsibility, but with those two in particular.
Just want to give a reaction to that. I agree with your point that audit committees really need to be very concerned about that. One of the fine lines that we're trying to balance, though, is we don't regulate audit committees. We can't tell audit committees what to do. We're trying to make sure that they're well informed about what we do and how they could improve audit quality with their oversight of the external auditor. So it's a fine line in terms of telling audit committees what they should do when it isn't directly affecting us. And I realize you can make the case that the internal audit function does directly affect the auditor and therefore directly affect us, but it's a real sensitivity about how far we go in terms of what we can do, because it's really about educating and just a reaction to something that Roman said as well, that from some of the audit committee chairs we hear from, including from some of the largest companies in America, and from their descriptions of what they're doing, sounds like they're doing what an audit committee should do. Even that top tier is asking more from us about what we do and what we see and what can help them do their job. So I think it crosses the entire spectrum of the audit committees that really don't know what to do and could use a little bit of help in understanding what we do, all the way to the top of the best audit committee chairs in the country asking us some of those same questions.
Yeah, as a result of some of our small group meetings with some audit committee members that clearly were top tier, I think we both came away enriched from those meetings and that experience. Loretta Cangialosi, I hope I got your last name right.
Yes, you did. You did a very good job. So I have a couple of comments. I agree with the comments that John White made. I think that's very important. I think overall, again, here I would say this is a very important effort, and I would kind of disagree with audit committees are weak, because that's not true in my experience. What they do have is they have people who have different backgrounds than auditors. So they are not auditors in and of themselves. So to expect them to understand how audits work, they will understand at a surface level because that's what they know. So I think what you're hearing a lot of is they want to know more about what questions should they be asking, because this is not their background. And for them to be very effective, they want that information. I do believe that they're aligned with the interests of the PCAOB. Fundamentally, audit quality is important to them. Every audit committee member I've ever talked to wants that. So I think this is very important. I would encourage smaller groups of people to have these discussions. I think you will get the richness that you want. I do think that, some of these objectives, when you talk about enhancing the ability of audit committees to discuss auditor inspection findings, to be perfectly honest, I think this feeds into the discussion we had yesterday about the general purpose reports, and I think we'll see some of that come out later, because what they're really asking is, okay, we see these reports and we have no context and we don't know what to do with them. So I think that's part of it. The other thing I would say is that you do not have the remit over the audit committees, and one of your objectives is finding ways for the PCAOB and audit committees to collaborate on efforts to enhance communication and interaction with investors. And to me, that seems a little overreaching. I'm not exactly sure where you're headed with that. So, you know, I do know that many audit committees have lead audit committee members, or not audit committees, but board of directors, have lead board of directors members. They meet with investors regularly. So I guess maybe I'm unclear on what your expectation is with that. So overall, you know, I think this is something that needs to be done. I do think audit committees want this information. It needs to be succinct, it needs to be relevant, it needs to have context, all the things that John said. So I think that, you know, again, this is something that roundtables, meetings with members, using organizations that have audit committee members, I think these are all outlets that you could utilize.
Gord, I just want to react to the point about investors, and one of the questions that we've asked some of the audit committees that have come into, members to come in and talk to us, how do they interact with investors? And some have said, you know, not a lot, because we got a lot of lawyers telling us we can't tell the investors anything, and that's not public information. So we kind of want to hear from audit committees about how they do, to the extent, so we can learn from it. So it better informs us. We have a number of groups we meet with, including our investor advisory group, that we hear a perspective, and so we're just trying to hear a variety of perspectives. But your point is well taken. That might be a little bit unclear as to what we're trying to do there. But part of it is just learning it so we can better understand.
Can I just ask a question too? Loretta, do you observe that the audit committee members that, in your experience, that don't understand auditing go to programs to try to get that information? And do you think more programs are needed so that audit committee members who don't have that background can better understand auditing? Is that your point there?
My point is that they're not auditors. So if your expectation is that they're auditors and they're going to somehow be able to have the same knowledge as the independent auditor and be able to, you know, ask those kinds of questions, they're not. That's not their background. So what they really are asking for is, you know, give us help on specific areas that we should be asking those questions that you think are about the audit process, because again, they understand scoping, they understand risk areas, very much so. That's an area that the audit committee has a really good understanding on. They probe on that, but you know, beyond that, if you're going to deal with inspections and what you call audit failures, it's very hard for them to connect the dots with that.
Elizabeth Mooney.
Thanks, Jeanette. Just on the, on the investor question you raised, Jay, I mean, investors expect that audit committees are, minding the store for investors. So you're right, there isn't a lot of direct communication with, excuse me, audit committee members. Sorry. But I think that just in the objectives and that last point, maybe you want to think about adding in, that investors do expect the audit committee members to be asking the hard questions of the auditors and to tell the auditors where they should be looking. I think when I look at the objectives, a lot of it is, auditor to audit committee, and it is a two-way dialogue. Investors are expecting the audit committee is capable of asking the questions and is asking those hard questions and telling the auditors where to look. So in terms of audit quality and emphasis, that's how you get there.
So would you advocate, I'm listening to what you're saying and thinking that maybe at some point we need a mechanism to communicate with investor groups to find out what their expectations are of audit committees and then work that into our communications as well?
I think the investor expectation is pretty simple. And I mean, yeah, in terms of that the audit committee, again, is telling the auditors where to look, where to make sure they know where the risks are, and are asking the hard questions about what the auditors did, and that they're educated to do that. And if there's, investors look very hard at who are the audit committee members, what are their backgrounds, are they capable of doing this? And when there aren't, when there are too many people that can't do that, when there's even more than, one or two, they get very concerned.
Okay, so you're talking about the expectation that audit committees are doing a good job at what they are supposed to do.
Yeah, and the dialogue is happening.
Okay, terrific. Bob Guido?
Thank you. Obviously very important and near and dear to my heart. I would agree with Loretta. There are a lot of audit committees out there doing the right thing. Is everyone on the same playing field? Probably not. But I can say that based on 7 years of doing this now and attending and participating as a speaker on many corporate governance sessions and panels of best practices, everyone out there has the right frame of mind, and that is up in their game. Everyone wants to up their game, and I think the firms that are represented in this room have really helped audit committees up their game. I do believe there's a two-way street going on communications of the auditors and the audit committee. And I just would, continue to push that communications and transparency to make both sides better. What I like about diversity on audit committees is that I find that some of the best questions, as an audit committee chair, some of the best questions have come from folks that don't have my background. And it really puts both senior management and the auditor on the spot, not even knowing what they've asked, but that it really puts antennas up, and I like that diversity. Having said all that, I focused in on F2 and this whole transparency and communications with investors, which I agree with, and I'm not sure what the right answer is, and I'm not sure if I really understood what that paragraph was leading towards, but let me say that in my mind anyway, I took it as there's going to be a lot of great byproducts coming out of this reach out. And what I think, and while you all don't have the responsibility or maybe the authority to dictate more proxy disclosures, I believe where we're headed in this is an increased transparency of audit committee reports and proxies. I would like someone to, take on that responsibility, because I think there's more that we can do as audit committees in our reporting to the shareholders that would help in that reach out and transparency.
Jeff Mahoney?
Thank you. I just wanted to register my support for item A of your objectives related to inspection reports and findings. It may be particularly well-timed. Our membership met last month and approved revisions to our policies regarding audit committee responsibilities for outside auditors. And within that revised policy, there's specific reference to PCAOB inspection reports as being something that audit committees should evaluate and consider as part of its oversight responsibilities. Thank you.
Archambault?
Thanks, Janet. Certainly fully supportive of this, and many of the comments that have previously been made I would agree with. A couple of additional thoughts. One of the difficult issues, obviously, is the availability of time and resources at the PCAOB to do this. So you have to, as John suggested, you don't want to try and overload and you need to be pretty selective. I know at times that you have reached out to individual audit committees of companies that where the audit firm has been inspected. And a suggestion I might have there, perhaps you're already doing this, but what we're seeing is that while there's audit committee meetings, more and more of the other board members are actually attending those meetings. So if you're having a meeting with an audit committee chair, you may want to actually ask if they want to invite others, because I think everybody on a board can benefit from the discussion. And certainly one of the key aspects is to help audit committees understand what impact they can have on the quality of the audit they'll be receiving. And also, I view the quality of an audit and the concept of audit quality different, with audit quality being a broader concept in my mind, because that involves all the others in the financial reporting chain. And I think they could benefit from that as well, to understand how they can have a larger part in the environment in which we exist in our capital markets to help audit quality. As Bob pointed out, there's differences in the skill sets of audit committee members, but any efforts you can have, I think if you're on an audit committee, just like everybody in this room, why do we do what we do? We always want to learn more, we want to know more, and opportunities to be able to do that, I think they would very much appreciate.
Arch, just a comment and a point of information to put some context around what you said. In our inspection process, for a portion of the engagements that we choose to inspect, we actually have our staff talk to the audit committee chair. Most of the time, I think it's a phone interview with a variety of questions about the communications between the auditor and the audit committee, and explaining what the inspection is and what we're looking at. We don't have a mechanism because of the confidentiality to circle back to say what we found, but that from those that we've heard from audit committee chairs that we've heard from that have had that conversation, they've reported to us that they find it extremely valuable, and some have suggested that we should do it in a higher percentage of the audits that we inspect than we do right now, which we're taking into consideration.
We've got 4 tent cards up, and we'll get to all of you in this session, and then we're going to move to some more nuts and bolts issues. And if you haven't had a chance to express your views in this session, feel free to go ahead and do that in the next session as well. Peter Clapman.
Well, first of all, I think the objectives of this project are really excellent, and probably among the more important priorities the PCAOB ought to have. And coming in at this stage, I've heard a lot of great statements already, some of the things that I would have liked to say, and they were said very well. But the part that I would address is what I see as the gap between what many audit committees do, and some of them do a really excellent job, but they are largely unaware of all of the assistance, understanding what the PCAOB can do for them and helping them do a better job. It's almost like the old saw about a tree falls in an empty forest, does it make a noise? And I think John White earlier talked about various avenues to get across to audit committees all the things that the PCAOB is putting out that would be helpful to audit committees, because I think many, unless there's somebody within that committee, particularly on the smaller or mid-sized companies that are not, and it was said earlier, not auditors, and it's a complex world with a lot of acronym governing agencies and the like, for them to finally fit in where the PCAOB fits in with making them better directors, whether they're on the audit committee or not, I think is critical. So I think maybe just imposing perhaps more burdens on the auditor to be informing the audit committee of PCAOB statements, reports, and the like, I think would be very critical. And again, I commend this as one of the most important things the PCAOB could do.
Walter Riccardi.
Thank you. SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations has had a very successful program of Chief Compliance Officer outreach, and they invite folks to come in different regions, and all the Chief Compliance Officers from that region to come in and hear from OC what they think they could be doing better, and listen to the Chief Compliance Officers. Some ways, a model like that, which, folks like Chuck may have attended. I attended from the SEC side, but I expect there might be some in the audience who've attended as Chief Compliance Officers. I think it's been a very successful program where you get people to come out, they give them a little free breakfast, and they all show up, and get a dialogue going with the audit committees and the PCAOB, where what information you give them to help them do a better job, and information to give back to you to help the PCAOB also. So I think that program, of course, they have resources with 11 regional offices, a lot more than the PCAOB, but it might be something that you could consider having a audit committee outreach, PCAOB audit committee outreach program to get folks to come in. Might be a similar program that might be similarly successful.
Gaitlin Hansen?
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in too, just to register my support for this project, and I think it's very, very important. Also, in line with what Scott previously mentioned, I think there should be in these objectives a linkage with responsibilities or role in audit quality and improving audit quality. As I was sitting here thinking about it, and I'm a big supporter, as I've said before, on the small firm forums. And I've seen from time to time a few empty seats there. I wonder why audit committee members could not be invited to those. There's great materials, information there that I think could apply to an audit committee member just as much as it would to auditors. Get them in the same room and interacting with auditors that are not from their own firm. But I think about the economic analysis for upcoming periods that are presented there, the discussions about independence, the importance of professional skepticism, the enforcement cases that they go over. I think you're already doing some things that if you widen the scope of it to invite some of these audit committee members, that there's some real opportunities there, and it wouldn't probably cost anything more than what you're already doing.
Thanks for that comment. Audit committee forums has been on our wish list of things to do, and we decided to hold off until we had this session, so I appreciate your comments. We've got several folks who have their tent cards up, and we will call on you after we introduce the next questions, and as I said, feel free to have your comments cover both sets of questions. So we're going to move to questions 4 through 6, and this is really getting into the how. How do we do this? It's sure sounding to me like Jay and I are going to need to go back and give our staff instructions to finesse the objectives a bit and come up with some strategies and a work plan. So we need to get down to some nuts and bolts, advice on how we can get started here. Question 4 is really more of a backdrop question. Of course, PCAOB is legally prohibited from providing certain types of firm-specific information to audit committees, but given this legal restriction, we still think there are plenty of effective types of communications that we can have. So again, keeping that in mind, your advice on specific communications and topics, we'd like to hear from you. Secondly, what methods do you think would be helpful? And we've gotten into that a little bit, but if you had to prioritize, we do have limited resources. How would we start? And then what ultimately do you think would be a good steady state for us to be communicating and receiving input from audit committees on audit quality measures, other indicators, and just any other topic that would be useful for audit committees' oversight of auditors? And then finally, how do we reach the largest number of audit committee members? And if we're going to employ a number of different methods, kind of who would benefit from that, and what types of methods do we need to have to be sure that we're doing two-way communications and that we're targeting the different groups out there and getting wide coverage, and again, through the various potential methods. So we'd like to hear your ideas on how to move forward and what you think would be most effective, and if you all have suggestions for how you can help. So let's start with Wayne Collins.
Thank you. My comments cover really the first item, the first topic, and just the prior one. It seems like one of the objectives is going beyond asking audit committees for input on audit quality indicators. It's one of the objectives is to enhance their ability to assess audit quality, going beyond the objectivity and independence, but other elements affecting audit quality. And one of the ways they can do that really dovetails with the audit quality indicator discussion we're going to be having later, and we had some of that yesterday, where to the extent that the audit quality indicators are not so comprehensive or understandable on their face, providing suggested questions that audit committees could ask the auditors with respect to the various indicators, to kind of peel away the onion layer to get to what the root is of the particular issue, or how the audit firm is actually handling something and the meaning of a particular indicator, rather than just having the indicator itself, but getting into a comprehensive discussion of what the indicator really means and the pointed questions to ask.
Thank you. As an auditor of smaller public companies, I would just like to offer my support for the project as being a very important project, and maybe to offer some insights that over the last several years, I think we have seen tremendous progress on the part of audit committees and their ability to understand and their thirst for knowledge, and probably the more successful educational sessions that we have offered to clients have been involving those that are open to directors and audit committees in helping them with their roles. So I think they are very open to receiving information. And I think some of the conversations we had yesterday regarding the general purpose reports would be very helpful in terms of addressing what I think is really important is your item C, helping them focus their attention on relevant and emerging audit risks and issues. We talked a bit yesterday with the general purpose reports, if there was some way that there could be information in there where the PCAOB addresses their risk assessment in terms of what they felt and why they felt certain issues were of importance in that particular time frame. So I think they're very open to that, and I think they look forward to that and welcome that. And we've seen such energy with audit committees that I think it's moving in the right direction.
Chuck Senator.
I think we're starting to see variations on a theme here. Two thoughts. First, I think Walter Ricciardi's onto something. When you think about an outreach effort, I have attended those SEC compliance outreach events, and there's a real winning chance there in terms of being able to have a communication forum on issues sort of in real time. The other thing that they've done recently is they actually webcast it so that you don't necessarily have to have people in person at the site. And it's a very rich agenda, and it's something that, through the interaction between panelists and regulators, gives a lot of good color for those of us that have to manage programs and think about those. So I see a real winning chance there, and I would agree wholeheartedly with Walter's suggestion. The second thing is sort of picking up on something Jean said, and that is we had a robust discussion yesterday in our outreach session, a breakout session, talking about the whole question of how you make the general reports more meaningful. And one of the things that our group talked about is sort of helping to seed conversations that audit committees can have with the auditors in a very similar fashion as the ultimate underlying objective of AS16 in terms of seeding conversations between auditors and audit committees. So to the extent that, for example, the exam staff happens to be noticing trends, don't necessarily have to get to a point where you actually have findings to report on. That can get a little bit stale, but it's basically the color and the observations that people are seeing. Thoughts in terms of possible issues that an audit committee should know about in order to inform them to ask questions could be on a regular basis part of the element of what you'd be doing in a general report to basically over time help educate audit committees on the types of questions they can be asking to sort of sharpen their focus and sharpen their skills. So I think between those two areas, the first being an opportunity to reach that wider audience. I mean, it's very scalable. You have the webcast, you have an agenda, something that could easily be a forum for gathering and having those conversations. And secondly, sort of a periodic education, not just of the audit committees, but of the industry in general in terms of what you're seeing out there in terms of the elements of your program.
Walt Kahn?
I too want to express my view of the importance of this project and focus on objective E, obtaining input about audit quality indicators, and adding to what Wayne said. I think it's really important that audit committee members from broad and diverse types of companies have the opportunity to provide input not only on what indicators are chosen, but how they would use the indicators, because there's some indicators that might seem interesting at first glance, but then once audit committee members think about how they would actually use them, they might not know. And I think the timing of this project is good given the AQI project, and presents a real opportunity for you to kick off this project in conjunction with that one.
Denny Beresford?
I wasn't sure if there would be time at the end for the summary observation that you mentioned, given all the tents that were up, so I decided I would come in now, particularly commenting on the last comment, Jeanette. An observation and a couple specific suggestions. Directors are challenged today. They are very busy. They have a hard time keeping up with what's going on in their companies. There's no requirement for continuing education, although many corporations do have their own governance requirements. Often those are fairly modest, maybe a couple of days a year. To the extent that they are requirements, they're broad. They're not just for the audit committee, they're for the corporation as a whole. There are lots of things that directors have to keep up on. Even if you're on the audit committee, you might be interested in the 200 or 300 page, whatever it is, document that the FASB just issued on lease accounting today, or yesterday, Larry, in addition to the things that the PCAOB would be working on. So there are many, many things that the audit committee members have to be concerned about. So, and unfortunately, many audit committee members just don't see continuing education as an essential. Bob mentioned before that there are a lot of continuing education courses out there. He attends many, I attend many. But if you add them all together, the excellent courses that are put on by PwC and KPMG and others, you're probably talking about 1,000, generously maybe 1,500 individuals who attend all of those courses together in the course of a year. And if there are 10,000 public companies, there might be 30,000, 35,000 audit committee members and so forth, so that means that only a certain very small percentage of them are attending formal continuing education courses. Many of them might be attending other courses that are a little less formal and so forth. So there is there's a great need still for many people to do more. So where do we stand? Cutting through all of the objectives, which I found actually excellent, it seems to me that it kind of comes down to 2 points. The first objective, in my mind, kind of summarizing them all, is that the PCAOB should get input from the audit committee community on its proposed standards and its other activities as well, but particularly on its proposed auditing standards. And that has happened to some extent, particularly with respect to the audit rotation issue, to a certain extent on a couple of the other projects, but only after a certain amount of really pushing people hard, and it hasn't really gotten organized very well. So I think there is a need for that to be organized better going forward. And then secondly, and I think this is what we've been talking a little bit more about today, that audit committees need to get better information from the PCAOB. There needs to be more regular information being provided about the PCAOB's activities from the PCAOB to the audit committees, particularly the great unwashed, if I can call them that, from the people I mentioned that aren't regularly attending the continuing education programs and so forth. Well, how can that be done? It seems to me that with respect to the former, the getting input from the audit committees, one very obvious way that could be done is to have an audit committee advisory group, much the same as we now have an investors advisory group, and of course this group, the standing advisory group. You do have 4 or 5 members, such as myself and Bob and a couple of others who are here today. The advantage of having a separate audit committee group would be, first of all, you'd have more diversity. You could have a larger number of people serving smaller companies as well as some of the larger companies. And frankly, some of the people who would, even if you had smaller companies represented here, they wouldn't be quite as intimidated by some of the stars that are at the SAG group who speak on the issues. So I think that would be a very easy thing to do, and I would encourage you to do that. And with respect to the other issue, I think we've talked a lot about getting the word out. Yesterday we talked about the reports and so forth. There are lots of good suggestions that I won't repeat. The one thing that I would add, though, and this has sort of been alluded to already, but I think there are plenty of meetings that the PCAOB could and should attend. I know you've been reluctant to attend some of these meetings in the past, but particularly the National Association of Corporate Directors, both the annual conference of that group, as well as they have a audit committee advisory council, the excellent seminars that are put on by the major firms, and I think that those types of conferences, even though you only reaching maybe 100 or so audit committee members at a time, that's still a large enough group that it's very worthwhile to have a number of people at one time rather than the one-off type meetings that you've mentioned before, when you have 5 or 6 or whatever members that come in at one time. That's not quite as useful as going out and speaking to 100 or 200 or so. That can be much more effective. And I think especially if these groups were encouraged to make more diverse their membership and get some of the smaller corporations involved, it can be even more effective. So those are my suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Denny. I think we'll add to our list of things to do to call you about every 2 weeks to get input on our progress. Brian Thalen.
Thanks, and again, appreciate everything that's going on and moving us forward in this direction. As somebody who's, I try to manage the audit committee schedule as best I can and manage the year out in scheduling meetings, topics, everything to make sure the rhythm flows. What would be helpful from a communication standpoint is if there were set communication periods that the PCAOB would have. So if there was, say, an annual report and a semi-annual report covering topics, and we talked about, what could be in the general report again, if that became much more useful, tangible, root cause focused, emerging risk focused, it would be easier to sequence those in to meetings, and so there could be time designated for education at an audit committee meeting, and I can only do that if I can see far enough into the future to make sure that I'm allotting the right amount of time to make sure that we're focused on those topics. So anything that you can do to come up with a more regular as opposed to ad hoc issuance of reports and information would be very helpful to me, because then that helps me make sure that I can get it in front of the committees and get things scheduled.
Rick Murray?
Thank you, Jeanette. A strong endorsement for taking this initiative and appreciation for putting it forward the way you have for open discussion. I'll take a fairly process-oriented answer, observation, starting with an endorsement for Denny's suggestion that use of the SAG itself may be a vehicle that helps. But clearly the goals of PCAOB outreach, visibility, wider visibility of the PCAOB, and a more general understanding of the board's ability to make things better is clearly desirable in all of those respects. The process observation is some good ideas work best by floating them and seeing what shape they seem to take. I don't think this is one. I think that there is danger in doing that, in that your objectives will be perceived by others rather than defined by you, often misperceived, and contribute to some of the strains in the reporting process rather than providing solutions. This is a very simplistic set of observations, but in the financial reporting process, there is a user community identified by law, the interests of investors, the interests of an efficient market and capital formation. The other end of the spectrum are our boards of directors responsible for issuers' performance against those rights. And in between lies the audit committee, the auditor, and the PCAOB. It does seem to me it would be helpful if, in explaining what the outreach program is designed to do and how it's going to go about it, the focus were to be on those three intermediating stages of the auditor, the audit committee, and the PCAOB, and how they can mutually assist one another to enhance both the quality of auditing and the understanding of what auditing is capable of doing.
Mike Gallagher?
Thanks, Jeanette. Just as to the question that's up on the board right now in terms of how you would get to the largest number of audit committee members, I think first it's got to be multiple means. Continue to do what works, which is the 101, which has been good. I think you also need to think about leveraging technology. And specifically, and we talked about it in one of our breakout groups yesterday, is having an audit committee corner. And the idea of this audit committee corner on your website would be, having it be branded such that it's required reading, before an audit committee member goes to a meeting. And the way it'll get there is if it's written, almost by an audit committee member. I'd almost hire Denny. He can write it for you. But the idea is that, the folks that know what it's like to be in an audit committee room can walk in the shoes of an audit committee member in terms of time constraints, having, the right amount of summary with the ability to dive deeper. If you do it right, it'll be branded such that, audit committee members won't want to go to an audit committee meeting without having been through that. And then also leveraging technology, ask for feedback. Ask me anything or send me your comments, those sort of things. It'll take time, but if that's done really, really well, I think there's a real opportunity. But by all means, continue what you're doing on the 101 reach out. This is an addition to, not a substitute for.
Richard Breeden?
Thanks. A lot of great comments this morning that I think have been very useful. I have two nuggets two logs to throw on the fire. One, as to the question up on the board here, I would just suggest that you find a high school student somewhere you could hire to do an app and put an app in the Apple App Store. It's crazy to talk about, no offense, Mike, going on your website and clicking on an auditor's corner. For goodness sakes, make an app, put it on my iPad, so when it's convenient to me, I can go click, and there will be all the latest pronouncements and things. And if you really bestirred yourself to do things that were a little more entertaining than just a dry copy of a report, I mean, you could put on your app things of commentary or panels that come along that are worthwhile. You could have a lot of content there, and you would reach directly to audit committee members in a way that was convenient to them. Every single one of them carries an iPad to an audit committee meeting. I mean, and on the way there, they could be brushing up. So just consider doing that. It would make the content you have get in the hands of people who will look at it if you make it convenient and easy to do so. Second thought is, it's striking to me, we talk incessantly about whether the audit committee members are sufficiently educated and so on. I don't think it's a problem with large company CFOs and controllers, including some of my colleagues here in the room, but I would suggest that you not entirely overlook the CFO community, particularly CFOs of smaller companies. And while there's sometimes an overlay of adversarialness here, there should be a healthy partnership between the members of the audit committee, the CFO, and his or her team, and hopefully the lead, the audit firm. And it just strikes me, I don't hear any concept of partnering between CFOs, whether beyond the SAG, in some of these discussions of things that how the audit committee can reinforce, and obviously we have oversight roles over the CFO, but you also want to enable the company to help the audit committee and vice versa, and don't forget them, don't leave them out of the process.
Before we go to the next person, I want to ask audit committee members who would like to have a last word or give us your last thoughts to please put up your tent cards. Jennifer Paquette.
I'm not an audit committee member. Do you want me to go ahead? I wanted to follow up on Richard's comment. I have a high school student for hire, but I think taking it to a different level is what I'd like to urge. A lot of the conversations yesterday and some this morning really touch on what to communicate, and I think we've gotten some great ideas from people in the profession on avenues on how to communicate. But I would suggest that when we need legal advice, we go to a lawyer. When we need audit advice, we go to auditors. When you need communication advice, I think you need to go to communication experts. This community, the board, the PCAOB staff, auditors, preparers, investors, we can give you good nuggets to feed into a communication plan. But I think you need a communications expert to advise on taking your communications to a new level. In the discussions about board reports in the breakout yesterday, some of the strengths that are already in existence were noted. Having a 5-page summary for a 40-page report, terrific. Let's keep going. Having communication, new communication tools for lay people require lay language, more white space on a piece of paper, something that does not look like a legal document, but I understand it'll be reviewed by a lawyer. I think there are tools that you need professional advice on how to develop. Part of the mission of the PCAOB is to use innovative tools to support the public trust in what you're doing. I think it's an opportunity you need to be bold about to create new communication avenues.
Thank you for those comments. I'm not seeing any tent cards up. Does that mean all audit committee members here agree with everything that's been said this morning? Any last word from audit committee members? Well, thank you very much for your very thoughtful input, and as we work through some details and planning on this, we will certainly be in touch with the SAG, and we will likely be updating you on our progress in the future. Jay, did you want to say anything?
No, nothing other than thanks. This has been great input. Challenges figuring out what the first steps are to get us going, and biggest bang for the buck in the near term. But I know a number of us are very interested and engaged in making sure that we show some progress in the next several months. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be moving to our next session now, and Helen and team coming back up. Those were great comments with respect to the outreach with audit committees. We'll look forward to getting the transcript from the transcriptionist here promptly. And there's going to be a long list of recommendations that came out of that discussion that we'll inventory, study, prioritize, organize, and think about in terms of how to improve that outreach. So very valuable comments, and we appreciate that very much. So yeah, Helen, yesterday we had lively sessions in the breakouts on the board's future general reports, and I'm looking forward to hear your summary of what you think you all heard.
I think you already did. To a certain extent, and as if we were sitting in the audience, we thought, well, there goes a lot of what we were going to talk about. But I think in every room we had more robust conversations than what was already covered, although we were able to, we spent a lot of time, especially in our room, talking about audit committees. We left here yesterday, our team here, we went back to the office, we pulled together an analysis of all the comments, and we've got each and every comment and each and every note that was taken compiled into a massive spreadsheet. I'm not going to go through that today. What we did, though, for today's purpose, was to group the comments that we heard into some general themes that I thought I would go through at a high level and then maybe turn to someone here as a representative of the different rooms. And I'm joined here by Maureen Austin, George Bodick, Santina Rocca, and Bettina Dufault, skipping over Brian in the middle, who's a permanent fixture up here along with Marty. And we'll give some highlights to those items, and then also ask and allow some time for any of the participants to clarify views, to add things that we hadn't risen to the level of this summary here. And I think the personal anecdotes will be very helpful to others in the room. We took the comments and we said, general reports should be, right? And that was a big topic of conversation for many people. We spent time talking about who should they be focused on, who is the audience, focused on readability, fewer footnotes, plain English, more simplistic language. A number of people called for a balanced discussion, on the positive side to celebrate success, and on the negative side to get into the deficiencies in a way that will help others prevent the deficiencies. George, I think your group spent a bit of time talking about that. Can you elaborate a little?
On the balanced nature? We did spend quite a bit of time talking about the balanced nature of the reports, or maybe the lack thereof currently. There was, I think, a general view that, an understanding that with the inspection reports, our individual inspection reports, that yes, those probably makes sense not to be balanced, that our objective is to identify deficiencies and observations. But separate and apart from the individual inspection reports, there was a view, well, for the general purpose reports or general reports, that yes, it would make sense to have more of a balanced discussion for many different reasons. Certainly focusing on the deficiencies of the observations point, but also if we see areas where firms are being so-called successful, if you will, quote unquote, that we should point that out and almost celebrate that success was a phrase that was used for many different objectives. One's to help maybe other firms learn so they can see what firms may be doing right in various areas, but also maybe from a broader, I maybe dare say public policy perspective, that from a student perspective in a pipeline of the profession, that having a balanced approach might be helpful from that perspective as well. So that was, I think, the theme of our discussion.
And just to add, I think in our group as well, we had a lot of discussion around this topic. I think it was a lot more focused is balance, but tone, in terms of the tone of the communications. There were, in addition to some of the things that George was mentioning, commentators in our group asked for more information on where things have improved, really talking as well about putting some of these findings within context in terms of the environment or the profession as a whole, and also just information about where no deficiencies have been identified, mentioning, linking a bit into what George was saying about celebrating some of the success, and that was certainly a very large topic of feedback in our group.
There was a call to stress in our reports the importance of auditors to the capital markets and the economy, and I thought that that was a helpful and useful point. One group focused on the appeal, and this kind of layers on to the discussion that you just had about communication and a communication specialist, but a call for a glossy type of a report. Something that would be easy to hand out and very accessible. So we'll certainly take that away. Bettina, we had some call for separate reports for different constituencies. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. A lot of discussion in our group about, in lieu of general purpose reports, to have targeted reports. The audit committee focus was significant in our group, and the relevance of information for purposes of those folks having the appropriate information to be able to interact with their external auditors. In terms of the format, a couple of ideas are batted around that you could have separate reports targeted to investors, audit committees, firms, et cetera. But then in addition to that, we could consider having a single purpose report with different sections targeted to the different users.
Right, including some of the... Including a thought that it would be nice if you could sort of drill down to your specific section of the report that you were interested in, much the way a user might tailor a news feed, so that they're only getting the pieces of a report or the pieces of information that are most relevant and that where they've indicated that they have an interest. From a content perspective, we heard a call across the different rooms for information on trends. Firm performance, commentary on the state of the profession, identify areas where audit performance has improved, and identify, to the extent possible, really, emerging issues. Early warnings and sort of risk alerts. I think this feeds into helping users know what they want to talk about with their auditor. There's a lot of interest in root cause, both failure and success. Maureen, I think your group talked about root cause.
Yeah, our group was very interested in the root cause and actually would have liked to have seen that discussion go even further. You know, why are those the root causes and what can be done about it? So I think that was one of the areas that people found very, very positive and helpful.
Right. And preparers said that they, in particular, would benefit from a root cause analysis. We had a little bit of discussion about the linkage between what the preparer is doing and what the auditor is doing, or how more difficult at times the job of the auditor can be, depending on what the preparer is or is not doing. From a best practices perspective, people thought other firms would find it helpful to see best practices discussed in a public report, and that it would be informative to other standard setters as well. In my room, we had a big call for reports that would include information that was actionable and decision-useful information. Bettina, what does that mean?
Well, our takeaway was that if you're reading a report, what decisions should I be making? How should I take that information and put it into practice? So don't just recount what you did, but tell me what to do with the information. Towards that end, the folks in our room also felt that the executive summaries were great. There were differing views in terms of the length of those summaries. I think some felt that they could be bulleted in half a page. Others felt that a page to a page and a half was appropriate, but I would say there was unanimity that an executive summary
was very important for people that need important information that's highly summarized. There was also discussion about examples, so to give detailed examples that you could bring the concepts to life in terms of live fact patterns.
Great. And I think that there was a call that, in addition to finding an executive summary helpful, it would be good to add a conclusion section. And the conclusion section should answer the question, so what? So we will definitely take that away. There was an interest in information and analysis on the findings. So some users and some participants called for very detailed information to be provided, whether it be in the report or in an appendix. What sort of information was that?
In our group, there was a request for some additional analysis of the findings. There was interest in having information on the findings broken out, perhaps by industry, by size of issuer. There was a request for the names of the issuers, which is, of course, something that we can't, that part we can't do, but there was a request in lieu of that to have information by industry and by issuer size. Also, some information requested in terms of the environmental factors or the economic factors, more context in terms of what was going on at the time of the audits taking place or the inspection taking place.
George, in your group, there was a call for information, providing information in a 4010 similar to what we share in our small business forums. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that's a good point, Helen. That was briefly mentioned in the previous session. There was some discussion we had regarding the small business forums and the view that not only the content but also the vehicle for the content was very useful and very helpful to some folks in our room. And in particular, one of the items that was highlighted was the economic analysis. If you've been to a small business forum, you may be aware or recall that our Office of Research and Analysis, generally at the beginning of the session, will provide a broad overview of general economic data trends. I think generally it's tried to do on a geographical basis, depending on where the small business forum is being held for that particular session. But that type of information in particular, the general economic information, was viewed as being helpful. I think particularly from a firm perspective where they could take that back and describe that, discuss that in a broader context with their clients and how they assess and consider various risks related to their audits.
There was a call to include a discussion of the areas of focus that we had addressed during our inspection. So in addition to the deficiencies, what were the areas that we had looked at? I think that leads a bit into the trends and understanding the rate of deficiency to a certain extent. How often did we look at it? How often did we have a finding? We had a call to define audit failure and a gradation of findings in the report. Some statistics around total issuer inspections completed, the number of audit failures identified, those audit failures, how many restated, how many resulted in bankruptcy, how many had a going concern opinion, et cetera. So really layering on to the call for more data in the reports. We had those who said, don't say audit failure. We had the audit committee focus, wanting questions to ask firms and the education of audit committee members being an important goal. As you just discussed, should we direct outreach to audit committees? And there was also a call to provide some international perspective. George, what was that?
Yes, we had some discussion regarding, this is probably a mix between future topics and just general content of the reports, but there was a perspective that, given now that we're doing a number of international inspections, that it would be helpful to receive some perspectives on what we're seeing around the world, if you will. And I think the primary focus, or one of the key focuses, was on any differences we may be seeing culturally or legally or otherwise between jurisdictions from an inspection perspective. And also I think there was a separate piece related to, if we're not able to get access to a given jurisdiction, whether that should be highlighted as well as part of the reports. But broadly speaking, there was some interest from an international perspective in what we're seeing.
Great. there was an interest in timeliness, and an interest in timeliness, I think, from all parties, internal and external. Maureen, how did that manifest itself in your room?
I mean, in our group, that was a big part of our discussion, and what folks had expressed interest in was almost receiving a top 10 findings, by September of the inspection year, so that there would be enough time, for both auditors and issuers to react to what we were finding. So that was probably the biggest area of discussion, and the top 10 list is really what we got that folks want to see.
Yeah, I thought that the notes from that comment were very interesting. It said this could be brief, just list the deficiencies. It could be anecdotal, willing to sacrifice detail for more timely communication of the key deficiencies identified, with a thought that these things would be helpful in planning the next audit cycle. And we heard that an annual report would be especially helpful for non-affiliated firms or triennially inspected firms that don't hear information as frequently in their session, and that they would like an annual report, and a report that is periodic and predictable. It doesn't arrive out of the blue, and that was a pretty common request. We talked about the format of the report. It's a suggestion that we consider short topics, which I think was discussed similar to SEC and FINRA reports. There was a call for flash reports. Which room was that, George?
Yeah, we were discussing that the content of the reports, and this was kind of wrapped around the general framework, and I would probably characterize it in the overall length of the reports and maybe the complexity of our reports. And there was a sense as a way to maybe get information quicker and in a more simple and targeted fashion, if you want, in terms of our topics, to move toward or consider a flash report type process, or at least a flash report type format of a report.
There was the thought to include appendices for different constituencies, provide more small business forum type documents more broadly. Although I think all those documents are available at the time we give the small business forum. But we'll get into here next up, distribution. And distribution is something that we spent a lot of time talking about, I think, in each of the rooms. There was the thought that we could enhance distribution by using other channels, such as the AICPA, FEI, IIA, NACD. There was the suggestion that we hold regional or public meetings to discuss the general report when it is issued, in addition to just meeting with the press, which is something that we've been doing this year. Bettina, we had a bit of time spent talking about, push versus pull versus a direct link. Could you summarize that?
I think we're being challenged to up our game in terms of how we disseminate information, but I think my takeaway was that we have a lot of good information to share, and how do we reach our audiences. So discussion of, is it best for people to go to the website in search of that information? I think there were some discussion points that with technology today, could we potentially tailor the website such that you could filter based on characteristics that you're looking for, information comes to you that way. I think we heard, today about maybe developing an app. Webcast was also thrown out, that in addition to issuing the report, that in connection with that, we have a webcast to talk about its contents. Press conference, we've done that before, and potentially that could be another good avenue. And then in addition, significant emphasis in our group on audit committees and the importance of providing them with relevant materials so they can make good decisions and interact with the auditors. So having a hot link directly on our website that Mike had suggested, the audit committee corner.
Yeah. Cynthia, did your group have anything further on that?
We talked about very similar items. I believe that the issue around communicating to the audit committees also came up in terms of helping them to better understand what they should do with the information that we'd received. But certainly the enhancing the distribution channels was a topic that came up, of trying to have more of these frequent regional meetings in addition to the press conferences, et cetera, that we've been doing.
Okay. And then I think that we had time for some discussion of future topics and what things people might like to hear about. Talked about an industry focus for different reports. One that I thought was really interesting was a call for a report on cybersecurity and the intersection of that and the audit could be very, very interesting, I think. We had a call for a report on independence. George, was that in your room? Yeah.
We had some discussion regarding future topics, as Helen mentioned. One of them was related to independence topics, and I would characterize as a broad brush on independence. Independence broadly stated, non-audit service focused and the types of services, but also a discussion of how firms comply with the standards. Is there a compliance officer at a firm, let's say, and how the process at the firm works from an independence perspective. And then also, interestingly, what responsibilities does the company or does the issuer, in our case, do they have that relates to independence, and how do, I think more broadly stated, the interaction between the firm, the engagement team doing the audit, as well as the company, interrelate and interact, or interlock, if you will, related to all independence matters.
Then we had a broad category just called other items. And the other items are really interesting. One of them, and we all had some discussion, we've had a discussion about this for some time, is consider rating the firms to drive audit quality. So I think you then spend an hour and a half talking about that a bit with Greg and his team, but maybe even naming a firm of the year was tossed out. So, you know, probably even better than employee of the year, but I'm still fighting for that one. There was a discussion that the reports could be forward-looking, sort of an audit risk alert type of a thing to assist firms with audit planning or information to be shared on risk assessment. And then we had a call for a report on the general state of audit committee quality. But I don't think that's quite our thing to cover. It'd be an interesting report, though. It's probably not going to come from us. So at a high level, those are the things that we had wanted to raise. I think it would be valuable if anyone has, other points or more clarity or more depth around any of these points that they'd like to share with the group. I'd like to open it up.
Ollie Cooney.
There were two things I wanted to comment on. One of the things we talked about in our group was audit failures, and that there is, I think, a fair amount of confusion, not among people in this room, but just in general around what actually constitutes an audit failure. And Helen talked about this, so I just wanted to elaborate on some of the ideas that we had talked about, and the summarizing audit failures by how many audit failures resulted in a restatement. Because I think there are some people who think that all audit failures result in a restatement, which is obviously not the case. The other category was audit failures that had a really large number of pervasive audit quality issues where they really missed the mark by a wide margin. And then audit failures that perhaps had a lot of good work that was done, but maybe there are one or two areas or a few more that really just tipped the balance, and your conclusion was that it didn't pass the test. Another piece of information, which I don't know, may or may not be available, but I would personally be interested to know, and I think audit committees would be interested to know, when an audit failure determination is made, do the firms agree with the conclusion? And so what percentage of the audit failures did the firms actually agree that the conclusion that was made by the PCAOB inspection team was appropriate? The other point I wanted to mention, which Helen, you also mentioned too, but just the area of best practices, I think is a great opportunity from what I believe in terms of leveraging the thousands of audit inspections that you all have done over the last 10 years. From a resource standpoint, I'm sure that might be a challenging role for you all to take on, but You really are the experts in inspections, and the amount of information that the inspection team has is really significant. So to leverage that information and to provide ideas, tools, and ways of best practices, what are the ingredients of a high-quality audit, to play a thought leadership role on that topic, I think would be a really valuable contribution.
Great, thank you. Steve?
Thank you. In our group, one of the comments you discussed, I think, was relevant to our discussion of targeted reports, and in particular on significant issues and risks, and we had a couple of things that we discussed. One was, I think you called it cybersecurity. Part of the focus was on what the auditor role is in internal controls. A significant aspect of internal controls clearly is general computer controls, and whether or not those responsibilities have changed with the proliferation of, attack and penetration activities from coordinated offshore sophisticated attempts. Because clearly, if you go into boardrooms and audit committees and ask firms who are in a number of industries, especially probably financial services, those who are involved in intellectual capital, including software development, social media, e-commerce, firms that are involved in infrastructure, including utilities, they're all terribly concerned about this. I think the question is, what should auditors be doing as part of their responsibility given this additional risk? And I think it would also be educational and helpful to board members, because it probably is number one issue that certainly is in financial institutions right now. And a second area we talked about was one where I think it's not a risk area, but one where further clarification would be beneficial. And I think it's in part because as audit firms have expanded their services, they've gone into more non-audit services, of course. And our audit committee, I know others asked the question, what does it mean when we have more non-audit services that are being disclosed in our proxy? And we vote proxies, and so we ask the question, what does it mean when we see a financial statement that has more non-audit services or a proxy? And what is the ratio, and is the disclosure adequate, and are those services proper? And of course, as you go in different jurisdictions, the permissible services vary significantly. In the U.S., we have very specific SEC rules on what is always proscribed and what is permissible under certain conditions. Those rules don't exist outside the U.S. in every jurisdiction, although the European Union, right now, is a European Parliament is considering adopting rules that very closely mirror the U.S. rules. But I think having a discussion on what you should look at in terms of non-audit services, how firms should be monitoring compliance with the independence requirements, and also what the corporate responsibility should be. So what should firms be doing themselves to help ensure their auditors are independent, and how should they be considering services more broadly?
Great, thank you. Elizabeth?
Thank you. I just wanted to emphasize the independence effort, idea for a project. Just that's really important, and we've observed some creep of non-audit services being done by audit firms to the point where, it comes up in our discussion of voting and ratifying the auditors. We've actually voted against sometimes where it does appear to be a problem. So I just would emphasize that as a really important project. It should be, part of, I think, any cross-checking with the audit quality indicators and, the inspection reports, like the whole look at, because they're obviously related. I would think independence would be a leading indicator of issues on audit qualities and inspection issues.
Great, thank you. Steve Harris?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Steve Bowler just mentioned and ask him, what would you like us to do in the area of cybersecurity? I think that is a highly legitimate issue, but in terms of the PCAOB and the board, whether it be through reports or auditing, what do you envision?
So I think in the context I was using it is, I think that auditors have a responsibility to audit internal controls, and part of that is general computer controls. And the question is, what is an audit committee and a board's expectation of what those procedures are? What are our findings? And is additional guidance necessary to help ensure that the auditors are being able to respond to this new environment? And the answer may be nothing is necessary, but the answer also may be that there, is a further clarification on what can be done as just even the best practice. But I think if nothing else, the audit committees would benefit from the guidance of the PCAOB and what they've seen in practice and best practice across their examinations.
Thank you. Anybody else have a comment or observation to share? Okay. Well, I really appreciate all of the good information that we have received. This is our third outreach session on general reports. We've spoken with academics, we've spoken with you all, we had another small group session. It's all been very helpful. We're gathering, I think, some good information, and we'll move in the second half of this year to a project to analyze that and try to come up with how that should influence the next generation of reports. I did want to put out a little bit of a disclaimer in terms of we have 4010 reports in the pipeline, and they're pretty far along, so they won't benefit from all of the great feedback that we've gotten here. But I do hope you'll find them useful. I do hope that the executive summaries, which have continued, will be helpful, and that we'll be able to get a conclusion in there too that I think should make them a little bit more useful. But the bulk of this we will take into consideration for the reports for the 2014 cycle. Thank you very much. We're ahead of schedule, but hopefully the Aurora people are here and ready to go.
That's unusual for us to be ahead of schedule. I tend to, when I'm speaking, get behind
When you're in
schedule.
charge, that never happens.
It never happens. You're much more efficient than I am, so I congratulate you. I'll learn from that. So we can do certainly take our break a little bit early, but before we do that, I thought since we have a few extra minutes here, we're always interested in SAG members' views on anything and any other topic that is on your mind that's not on our agenda. So if anybody has something that you think is of valuable interest to us that we should think about, know about, or consider, certainly feel free to put your 10 card up and share some thoughts with us. One of the things we did at a SAG meeting last year was, I went over the standard setting agenda yesterday, but last year we had a session where we talked about what might future standard setting projects be, and we had a very lively discussion on that. We intend to follow up and get back with you all on that, but again, any thoughts you have on any particular matters, we'll take the opportunity now to let you discuss some of those things, or if we finish even early today, I'm going to give you the idea to maybe think of some things you might want to bring up before you leave today. So I see right away Rick Murray put his card up. So Rick, you have the floor.
And I'm not going to take up all the additional time that you have. A curiosity, Marty. The last couple of meetings, we've had some extensive discussions of fraud and what the board should be doing to address it, and whether a structured fraud center of some kind should be undertaken. I either didn't notice or I didn't listen well yesterday when you were presenting the future agenda to seeing that reappear. And in many respects, the communications issues that have been the focus of this agenda are ways of getting at the fraud issue and providing a kind of indirect forum for enlightening expectations and possibilities. And my question is this a proper interpretation that this is an alternate way to go about dealing with that issue that the board's considering, or is this a separate issue with no connection with, or no intended connection with fraud issue?
Based on the question, you were listening very well yesterday to things I covered or didn't cover. So one of the topics that we discussed very deeply at a SAG meeting, I think just about a year ago, as I mentioned, was a list of things that should be on our agenda going forward. We laid out about 10 or 12 possibilities, and one of them was a task force of the SAG with respect to fraud, and considering are the responsibilities of auditors with respect to fraud appropriate today? Should there be greater communications about fraud risks? How else should we think about fraud and all aspects of what we should be doing in that area? Of the 12 or so items on the list we put out there, that one was the number one in terms of SAG members saying, we think you should go ahead with that, and we would support a SAG task force that would consider further fraud risk, what auditors do about fraud, what else can be done about fraud, or deeper research into fraud. So we have taken that back with us. We started to do some additional work to think about how we would organize that. It still is high on our list, but what we have in front of it is a number of very important standard-setting projects that we want to complete and get them out there in the next couple of months. And so that had taken priority in terms of the attention of our scarce resources. So, but your question is a good one. These other matters we're talking about today are all good ways to think about communications that talk about emerging risks and things of that nature come across as good vehicles for us to communicate to audit committees and others. We do put out practice alerts where we see some risk, but we did talk about getting more alerts out, or you all talked about getting more alerts out where we see emerging risks and getting more of that out to audit committee members in their oversight roles. Those are alternative ways, but no, we have not decided to take that as an alternative route. We still have in mind formulating in some fashion the good advice you all gave us about, yes, consider more in-depth, in a more in-depth way, how the SAG can help us think about how we could improve prevention, detection of fraud in the future and going forward, and we still intend to move on that. So good question. Thanks a lot for reminding us. I think the second card I saw go up was Roman Wheel.
So Marty, you know what I'm interested in because we've had communication. If it's ripe, would you tell us about the schedule for considering that issue? And if it's not, we'll just pass it by.
Why don't you summarize for the group your concern, Roman?
All right, so this has to do ultimately with the communication between lawyers and auditors about impending obligations, liabilities, lawsuits. I have firsthand observation of a lawyer getting up and saying, my client has a significant impending liability. I can talk to you, email you what it was about. That's not important, what particular liability is. But my client has told me that if I tell the auditor about it, I get fired. I now believe, and apparently the PCAOB has heard from the FASB some concerns about it, that the communications from lawyers to auditors about impending obligations, which is based on a 1975, I think, agreement, is not working. And auditors ask and are told, but they're not getting the truth. And so I wrote Marty about this, gave him the details of the particular obligation and what the data were, and what the lawyer said. I ran a panel at Stanford Law School, and we had a bunch of lawyers, and one of them got up and said this, and a lot of lawyers nodded their head. So I believe that the auditors are sort of not getting the right stuff when it comes to this, and we ought to do something about it. When I wrote Marty about it, he said, you know, the FASB has also brought up this, and we're thinking about it, intending to do something, and I'm not sure what steps are going on or might go on is what I'm asking about.
So that was a recent correspondence from Rick to me in connection with this upcoming meeting, and that has been a concern. It is an audit. It is a risk. The auditors are highly dependent upon the communications with attorneys about legal matters and legal contingencies, and there have been issues and questions in the past about surprises, if you will, of certain matters not being disclosed as contingencies in the financial statements, and shortly after year-end, large settlements being reported about legal matters that shareholders were surprised about. Larry, I might want to ask you to weigh in for a second, because I know FASB did some proposals about improving are changing disclosure requirements on legal contingencies. And I know you had a lot of feedback and input on that in connection with this whole question of adequacy of the disclosure on legal contingencies. Brian, I might even ask you to comment next about that, because one of the responses to that, I think, was an increased effort by CorpFin to look at the adequacy of disclosures around legal contingencies. So I guess my response immediately back to you, Roman, was that, yeah, this has been an issue that's gotten attention at FASB, it got attention at SEC, and in fact, we talked about it, Helen and I, in terms of inspections and looking at inspection areas about what are we seeing the auditors getting from attorneys, and what are we seeing being disclosed in financial statements about legal contingencies as a potential inspection audit risk. So it's been getting a lot of attention, I think, and maybe I'll start with Larry, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Marty. We did have a project a few years ago. We issued an exposure draft to change the disclosure requirements surrounding litigation. We received pretty violent reaction to the exposure draft on both sides. Effectively, a number of investors saying we hadn't gone far enough in terms of what we required. Preparers and lawyers weighing in saying we had gone way too far. What we were requiring would be prejudicial against the company, et cetera. We held a roundtable where both lawyers and investors were asked to attend, and I think as a result of that, we came away with I think both groups, if you will, in general, came away with a better understanding of what the concerns of each group were. And we also pointed out at that roundtable what the current requirements were, so that people were reminded of what they were. Talked to the SEC, had a lot of discussions with the SEC, and then the SEC, in fact, as you indicated, kind of stepped up their oversight, if you will, surrounding companies' disclosures of litigation. I think as a result of that, the observations of CorpFin were that litigation disclosures had improved, and I think this goes back a couple of years ago. And as a result of that, we evaluated and said we thought that this was more of a compliance issue as opposed to a problem with the requirements in the literature, and then we subsequently dropped the project. Now, it's incumbent upon the financial reporting community, including auditors, the SEC, et cetera, to ensure that what's required under FAS 5 right now is being complied with. But so that's where it is today.
Brian, did you want to, I know that CorpFin did perform some additional work, and maybe you can talk about the timing of that and whatever else you can share.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. And I don't have a lot to add to what Larry's described. I think he described it well in terms of a step up in terms of the area of focus for CorpFin in the review process. Not that it's not been an area that they constantly look at, but certainly more targeted focus, and the view that disclosure had improved as a result vis-a-vis compliance against existing standards. Clearly an area that continues to be of interest. And I think Larry said it well, the financial community broadly and regulators have an ongoing responsibility against existing standards to make sure that we have appropriate compliance, but certainly to the extent that we begin to see disclosures of where there were no disclosures, and then all of a sudden there's a payment. It's not going to be unusual to have questions in that space as to was it reasonably possible in a prior period, and should there have been earlier disclosure. And so it's certainly an area that deserves ongoing attention.
I wonder, in response to Roman's comment, whether any of the auditors have a view as to whether the existing attorney-auditor communication is working. Roman sort of making an assertion. He thinks there's, at least in one case he was aware of it didn't work, but I wondered if anybody else had any commentary on that. I think I see Arch, your card is up. I don't know if it's on that subject or not.
Actually, I put the card up because of another topic I was going to bring up, but I can't help but to speak to this one. Because what Roman raises here is really an integrity issue. You're talking about the integrity of the lawyer, you're talking about the integrity of management. And if this was to come to my attention, it'd be resignation. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think the attorney-auditor communications are working well. There are certainly issues surrounding disclosures, which is actually the other thing I was going to bring up here, as to whether or not the PCAOB, the auditing group, and I spoke with Jennifer Rand offhand last night a little bit about it. If there's any project about disclosures that is in the pipeline, Marty, I know you're aware that at the IAASB there's a disclosures project, and that happens to be one I'm involved with. Because in the connection with the financial crisis, we had a lot of input about concerns over the extended disclosures, the clarity of disclosures, and the FASB has a disclosure framework project going on. EFRAG has one going on. But we were getting input that from auditors and others as to, should there be changes to the standards with respect to auditing disclosures, and we've been taking a look at that. And you're dealing with certainly at the planning stage, trying to get auditors to be thinking about disclosures much earlier in the process. Concepts of materiality with disclosures is a key issue. How do you assess whether there is a material misstatement of a qualitative type of disclosure? So we're looking into a lot of issues surrounding that. But with respect to enrollment, my reaction is things seem to be working well. I think the SEC has seen the robustness of disclosures surrounding litigation improving. It's something, obviously, when we come across a matter that we have to get representations from attorneys, we think about very carefully. There's a lot of times I've had discussions with audit teams and with lawyers that if there's litigation going on, a zero accrual is most likely not the right answer. But I understand the concerns that were raised with the FASB proposal and the reasons why the direction they were going could have created issues from the legal community. So critical area, but overall I think it's working as was intended.
Good, thanks for those comments. And I agree, the SAG has had a number of discussions over the years and about evaluating disclosures in connection with material misstatement that auditors, and it was pointed out a number of times that auditors do a pretty good job of evaluating quantitative errors they find and whether or not those adjustments have to be recorded in order for the financial statements to be presented fairly. But many have pointed out it's far more challenging to evaluate a qualitative disclosure as to whether or not that disclosure is such that its inadequacy is such that the financial statements don't present fairly. So we're watching your project very closely. Obviously, the FASB's disclosure framework project, and even the SEC, I think Paul Beswick has announced a project on the boundaries of disclosures between MD&A and what's in the financial statements. So there's a lot going on in this entire space, and it certainly is an area where we're thinking about what our project might be in this regard as well, if we wanted to take that up. I think I saw cards from Rick Murray's your card on this subject. That's from before. Then John White, and then I'm sure that we'll be late for break again since I've taken charge of this.
Just to get our kind of level setting here, there were two things that happened back in the 70s. There's obviously FAS 5, which you've been talking about, and the disclosure requirements that flowed out of that, and what Larry and Brian have been talking about is the first FASB and then the SEC looking at, I'll just call it, what was in FAS 5 and the enforcement of FAS 5. But there was also, in 1975, the so-called treaty between the ABA and the auditing profession that lays out the groundwork for these letters that lawyers provide. And it's a totally separate document. It's a totally separate discussion. You actually have the treaty on your website as part of the standard for auditing contingencies in terms of where to find it. I think you could think about going back to the ABA and thinking about re-looking at the treaty. I mean, it is, whatever it is, 35 years old or so. And that's, I think, a different project than the contingency disclosure issue. This is the communications between the lawyers who are working on these litigations and the auditing and the auditors. And that clearly is within your jurisdiction. The disclosure topic, I would have said, is more in the FASB and SEC jurisdiction, but this is really your jurisdiction.
Yeah, what also is in our jurisdiction is to inspect whether auditors have appropriately obtained representation and followed that guidelines of that treaty and obtained the letters and evaluated the content of what they're getting from the attorneys, evaluating what's in the minutes of the board of directors, et cetera, in connection with what's being disclosed about legal matters. So there's, in our court, as well as in FASB and the SEC's court, I think a lot of this, but we have thought about that treaty from time to time. It depends upon what we're hearing in terms of how effective the process is working. So, but thank you for that comment. We should think about that from time to time. So why don't I give the last word on this subject to Chairman Doty, and then I think Jeff Mahoney have your card up too, so I didn't see that. So Jim and then Jeff.
I had been listening to this and thinking that we had no organizational responsibility interest in this as a board until John's comment came along, but he correctly reminds us of the accord, the treaty. There is a legislative fix for this. There has been a legislative fix for a long time. If it goes to audit integrity, and if it goes to the ability of the auditor to perform their duty, that lawyers are concerned about breaching the privilege, some of the money that is spent on lobbying the Hill could go to this legislative fix. At the time of the McKesson-Robbins case, people got into this. They re-examined the case law. It was apparent that judge-made law in this area does make it very difficult to communicate with auditors without running the risk of a plaintiff being successful in claiming that the auditor has in fact breached the confidentiality and the work product privilege. At the time of the McKesson case and some years ago, bills were introduced at the instance of the bar, actually, to recognize that the doctrine of identity of interest, which is at the basis of the privilege, needs to be addressed. And I think that, without ducking John's question, I think there are questions that have to be addressed in terms of the ability to preserve the integrity of the audit with candid communications between attorneys and auditors. I just say that I think the nerve gangling of this that has to be attacked is a judge-made notion, a judge-made concept that unless you can prove absolute identity of interest, you lose the privilege. That is not based in the statute. It has a long and tortured history, and I think that's where the profession should go with its lobbying if it needs that to preserve the integrity of the audit.
Thanks, Jim. Jeff, did you have a comment?
I had some involvement in this debate in connection with the FASB's project because I was on their ITAC committee at the time. So I had a number of discussions with the legal profession, and as a result of that, I've sent you emails suggesting that the treaty might be something you want to look into. The legal profession made it very difficult on the FASB, many of them citing to the treaty as the reason why they were not supportive of any improvement to disclosures. Some of my side conversations with representatives of the profession indicated that disclosures should be improved and can be improved, and there are ways that it can be done. However, the FASB constantly ran up against the treaty, and because of the treaty, we could not, they indicate they can't support the disclosure. So I think it is, as Mr. White said, it's been many, many years since that treaty was put in place, and I think it's certainly, it's time to take a look at it, and in my opinion, it can be improved. and an improvement can be made that would help advance disclosures in this area, which are very important to investors. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And Roman, you got a good conversation started about a very important subject, so thanks for that. And we got a lot of great input on it. And I did my job of making sure you didn't have any extra free time and you're a little late for break. We'll take our break now and be back at 11 a.m. for the session on the audit quality indicators. Thanks very much.
be starting momentarily. Please return to your seats.
Great, thanks for getting back promptly. We're about ready to begin our last and very important session of this day-and-a-half meeting, and that's the report back from the breakout sessions on the discussion of audit quality indicators. Again, the session I participated in was lively and a lot of good input. And Greg Jonas, kick it off and tell us what you heard.
Great, Marty, thanks. You should each have in front of you a document that summarizes what we believe we captured yesterday during the breakouts. Before proceeding, let me remind you that the views in that document and what we're about to discuss are only the views of individual staff members, don't represent necessarily the views of the board or the other staff. Also, let me observe this is not a public document. It is for our use here in this debrief session. You can take it with you, but if you could please keep it confidential as a SAG member. When we do present to the world the results of input that we've received on this project, we'll do it in the normal way that we do it at the PCAOB, and this is just for our use today. So, what we did last evening to collect this information were two things. First, we got all the forms from everyone, and thank you very much for completing those. And we had one team working on tabulating the data. We also had, as you know, note takers in each of the sessions, the 4 breakouts, and we had a separate team of folks who were in those sessions who reflected on what were the themes that came out of the discussion. And then after we had the data tabulated, we stepped back from the totality of all of it, put the 2 teams in the same room, and then brainstormed about what we thought were the common themes, as well as what we thought was the most interesting in the data. So that's what we have in front of you now. The deck starts with a summary of main points, and then we look at the top 15 ranked metrics, and we show that to you in 2 ways. And then the bottom 15, again, we show that to you both ways. And then we looked at the AQIs that were most controversial, and what we meant by controversial is had the largest standard deviation in the scoring that you all gave us. And then we will play to you what people suggested as additional kinds of metrics that we should think about. And then finally, the last 3 things are some qualitative commentary about unit of account, the audit quality definition, and then the framework definition. So what we plan here is George Wilford will walk us through the deck at a high level. We're going to take only about 10 minutes for that. We'd like to spend the vast majority of our time here hearing from you and your reaction to what you're seeing in your reaction now to having thought about this more over the course of the day. So, George?
Thanks, Greg. So the summary of the major themes based on your responses were that SAG members were generally supportive of the PCAOB efforts. The SAG identified about a dozen metrics which have merit and approximately a dozen that did not have wide support. SAG members generally thought that the audit quality definition was directionally correct. However, the suggestion was to consider incorporating compliance with standards within the definition itself. The majority of those who responded supported the framework, but some suggested simplification. The nature of the AQI should dictate the unit of account which would be most appropriate. That was another theme. And then the need for context when interpreting quantitative metrics. And I don't know, how many of you have seen or read Michael Lewis's book Moneyball? It was a movie about baseball, and anyways, I thought one SAG member responded, it said, "Don't bring Moneyball to the accounting profession." So the movie was about how quants have taken over the game of baseball, so I thought it was an interesting analogy, but that's not quite where we intended on heading, but anyways. And finally, beware of unintended consequences was another major theme. Okay, so reflected on the next slide is the top 15 ranked AQIs. I'm not going to go through all these. There's a lot of detail here, and we're going to go through this fairly rapidly to allow time for your input. But I'll just go through the first several of them. Number and nature of PCAOB inspection findings was the clear winner here, and we thought that was important too. You might notice it's reflected in 1 and 3, and the reason for that is we thought it was so important that we had it as a process indicator and as a results indicator. So obviously the SAG members agreed with that because it was also 1 and 3 in our ranking. Partner manager engagement, quality review hours, and timing relative to the total audit effort was another major one. Frequency and market impact of restatements, trends in PCAOB and SEC enforcement actions, industry expertise and proficiency was another one that ranked highly, and average years of experience and headcount composition. You can see that along the horizontal axis, you can see that this reflects the dispersion of the SAG member responses, and then there's a weighted average, and that's how we ranked it, was based on the weighted average.
And George, can I add just one observation? For the top dozen or so metrics, I was impressed with how relatively few SAG members put these metrics in the 1 and 2 category. So not only were the average scores fairly high, but the dispersion seemed to be weighted heavily toward the upper end. That surprised me a little bit.
Okay, on the next slide is again the top 15 ranked AQIs, but this time we've reflected the weighted average by thought leader category. So you can see how the academics voted on this, and this is the weighted average of that particular group. The audit committee members, auditors, investor or investor advocate, issuer, and then other. Next is the bottom-ranked AQIs, and we've reflected this in descending order. And again, along the horizontal axis, it reflects the dispersion of SAG member responses and the weighted average.
And just at the risk of piling on, generally if you didn't like a metric, you all didn't like a metric, I've noticed.
Yeah.
It's pretty. We do have a slide coming up that George will walk us through about the controversial metrics, but just generally speaking, looking at this dispersion, there seemed to be a fair consensus on some of these.
And again, the next slide is the bottom-ranked AQIs, but again, it reflects the weighted average by thought leader category. And then moving along, the AQIs ranked as the most controversial. And here what we did was we calculated the standard deviation for all 40 AQIs, and then we ranked them. And one of the things you can do is you can look at the dispersion of the responses and cross-reference this to page 5 and 7. So for example, one of the most controversial AQIs was the number and size of auditor resignations. So if you go back to page 7, you can see that shows up as rank 28. Remember, it's in descending order. And you can see how it's got a very wide dispersion, and so that's why it's reflected as one of the more controversial. Same thing, you can look at percentage of work outsourced to service centers. If you go back to page 7, you'll see that reflected as number 32, and you can see the wide dispersion there among different. And then to follow on, you can go to the next slide, and you can see how different thought leaders voted. So we're going to give you some time to study this. And then let's move on to the next slide, selected proposed indicators. We received a total of 27 additional suggested indicators. The examples are reflected below. Timing of engagement partner hours during the audit, absolute and relative investment in the audit practice versus other service lines, ratio of non-audit services to audit services, percentage of professionals that are CPAs by each level, segment results by market cap and sector and geography, number of clients in industry sector, restatements by industry sector. So that's a list. We appreciate all the feedback, not all 27. We didn't reflect all 27 here. This is just the top third that we reflected. Some of them were similar to each other, so we tried our best to consolidate these into groups. But we do appreciate your input on this, and even if it's not reflected on the slide, that we're still giving all the feedback consideration. The next slide is a unit of account, and most SAG members supported the level at the unit of account at the engagement team level. The second was at the affiliate firm level. And I think the overall consensus is that the nature of the AQI would dictate the unit of account that was most appropriate. I think in hindsight, when we passed out those surveys, probably what I should have done is had a column that said, and allowed you to designate which unit of count you thought was appropriate for each AQI. But again, we received a lot of great feedback in the sessions, and we appreciate that. Next theme was different professional groups may want a different account. That's very intuitive. An audit committee would want specific engagement level information. Investors may be interested in metrics or AQIs at the firm level. And then lastly, cost benefit analysis would be important for any AQI consideration. And then when it came to the definition, audit quality definition, the most common suggestion was to include language about compliance with PCAOB standards. And other comments included references to robust communication with audit committee responses wasn't clear. There was a couple that suggested perhaps that the going concern wasn't necessary for the definition. And the definition should not be only considered from the audit committee perspective. That's not really what we intended, but of course, we intended this to be for investors, and so that would certainly be a change that we'll add to our definition. Definition should mention compliance with accounting standards as well. That was another remark. And then when it came to the framework, the most common suggestion was that the framework should be simplified. And and then the other comments were aligned with PCAOB QC standards. We did our best to do that within, the House. If you recall, the House was kind of a hybrid between the COSO framework and the PCAOB QC standards, but we can go back and take a look at that. Measuring audit quality quantitatively can be challenging. Yeah, that's a fair remark. But with respect to that, Greg, I don't know if I want to turn it back to you, and if you have any remarks before you.
Great, George. Thanks. No, I don't. We want to spend most of our time listening here and seeking your reaction. So this is what we thought we heard yesterday, and welcome your reaction, counsel, suggestions, points of amplification, any place you thought we got it wrong. I could tell a few jokes. They're not good jokes. Peter.
I think you have enough going with just the ones that, the particular issues that received the most positive and then the most negative, but there were certain nuances that came about in the conversation where something might have gotten a low response, or maybe it's a controversial response, where it was because the way it was stated could cut either way. And I was wondering if maybe you could restate some of these to make it clear a direction, or maybe parse the question a little bit differently, so that instead of cutting both ways at the end of the analysis, it has a clear connotation. I think you have enough to do even without doing that, but I'm wondering whether some of the more controversial, or even in some cases some of the lower rated questions or issues could, with a little tweaking, be elevated.
Excellent point. At least in our group, the following, I saw the following thought processes. One was some of the metrics were criticized because whether whether the metric was high or low, you could interpret that either way, that was good or bad. And folks thought that, look, if you're scratching your head and wondering what it means, that's the sign of a really bad metric. So, people took those off the table. And I think a number of these that you put on the kind of bad list, I think, fall into that category. But another notion we saw with some of the metrics was the notion of outliers are bad, but between the outliers, there's this kind of fairway where play in the fairway kind of felt right, but if the score was extremely high or low, that could be a sign of trouble. And those, I think, people tended to keep in, but just wanted to note that outlying is the concept that seemed to be worthy for those recommendations, or for those metrics. And then the third class of metrics are the obvious ones where, a high score is always perceived as, say, better than a lower score. I'm sorry, Roman.
In my responses, as you know, since I signed it, I was concerned about what's objectively measurable and which requires judgment. On this list of the top 15, I have circled number 5, number 6, number 10, and the first number 11 as not objective as currently stated. I have no idea what you mean by trends in enforcement actions. Industry expertise and proficient, is that binary, yes or no? If that's what you mean, then it is objective. Number 10, it get turned off. I guess they don't want to hear me. Relative emphasis, that's not objective. And excessive turnover, is that binary? So I'm really pleased that only 4 of these, as stated, appear not to be objective, and at least 2 or 3 of those could be turned into objective, but I don't know what you don't have objective measures, and you have to use judgments.
Thank you. One reaction is, I agree with you, I think we all do, that we have work to do on the metrics that appear to have promise. We have work to do to ensure that they are objective, and we intend to try to develop an objective metric in these areas and then do some testing. And ultimately, we want to see if the results, once we have confidence in the metric itself, to see if the metric is indeed correlated to some output measures of quality as a means of testing. But Roman, your counsel strikes me as very right, that we have work to do to improve the objectivity of some of these metrics. Arnold?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for sharing all these data in such a quick time. Part of the discussion in our group was also then what to do about it. And that was against the background of some of the comments that already have been made. How should you read indicators? Would some be a positive or a negative signal, etc.? And I think the group concluded more or less that therefore the context in which this is discussed, in particular with an audit committee, is very important. And we compared it a bit with the draft framework of the IAASB. There is a lot of emphasis on the process, and therefore it should inform an audit committee, and of course the auditors themselves, for an informed discussion in order to assess audit quality. And that's what I'm missing a bit on these slides, that it's not just on the indicators themselves, but then also how they will be used and how they will stimulate, let's say, a very highly qualitative assessment of audit work. And in the event, we noted that that might be shared in a kind of summary analysis with investors and shareholders as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Arnold. Bob Guido?
The project is not easy, so I would, first of all, congratulate you and your team for a great summation. But the work has just started, I think, and again, with the end point being audit quality, I think that's our objective. The way you formatted this, I congratulate the team too. There's a lot of in-between messages here as we look at them and analyze them, and I'm sure you all will take a lot of care in that. I focused on one real quick though, and that's the top-ranked AQI's item is sorted by thought leader category, and items 3 and 4 jump out with a disconnect amongst the audit committee, the auditor, and the quote investor advocate. And that may go back to the communication and transparency of your reporting that we've talked about before, and the education process to what really the results mean. So I would really focus on, bridging the gap there, because obviously there's some stories with that, with the different weighting. And last but not least, whatever we do here, whatever y'all decide on audit quality indicators, I would strongly encourage some, quote, pilot testing and field testing on an interim basis with a lot of evidence around it before you drive it across the profession. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Jeff Mahoney?
Thank you. I just wanted to express my support for the, on page 12, the third comment relating to the definition, given the PCAOB's mission to protect investors, and I think that it's widely recognized that the audit is mainly to serve investors. I think that's an important point that should be emphasized in the definition. Thank you.
Elizabeth Mooney.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, I would echo that comment, obviously, but also just encourage that the results be made public, the indicators be made public, and so that and at the engagement level that there be, I'm sure you're going to provide more clarity on what's at the firm level, what's at the engagement level, but that'll be a really important area we focus on. But another thing, and that I'd like to also echo the suggestion for the ratio of the non-audit to audit fee or audit services provided by the firm. And I think another area that would be important to include in the discussion by the audit committee on the audit quality indicators would be, the duration or tenure of the relationship. If it's a 1 year, if it's only been 1 year, you're going to have a different sort of context for looking at the quality indicators. But and I think it's also very important to know if it's been a long-term relationship. I think that's real important in the quality discussion, but also in the independence work that the PCAOB is considering.
Elizabeth, thank you. I noted a few minutes ago that George, when talking about how the unit of account might depend on who the user of the data was, And he observed that, for example, audit committees might want, at least for the engagement they're directly involved in, engagement level data, in addition to some other level data, but at least engagement level data. And he observed that perhaps investors might want firm level data. Maybe you could relate to this group the conversation you and I had outside here a few minutes ago when you, as a user of financial statements, had a different view about what unit of account you would like.
I was just saying that, in terms of the firm level data, I'm not sure how useful that would be. I mean, the only way I can imagine, using it would be set to, if one of the big four firms or big six firms, ranks last, not ratifying the auditor on every proxy vote is just not a real, good outcome for investors or anybody. So that's the firm level data. I don't really feel like investors will pay a ton of attention to that. It'll be interesting, but I think the engagement level data is critical.
John White?
Yeah, I mean, just to state the obvious, but you do get what you measure. And so as you decide on which of these indicators you're going to use, you will, the result will be that the audit firms and the audit committees, their behavior will change and they will move on each of the indicators doing whatever it is to get higher scores. And I guess that's stating the obvious. It may not always be, I mean, there are lots of ways of gaming the system on many of them, and just you will have you may have a profound effect on a variety of things as you choose the indicators.
Let me ask the three of us, the three of you plus myself who moderated. In my group, the tone of the discussion I felt was that these metrics will matter, to John's point, that people will react to them. It's not that people will look at these and find them irrelevant, and they will agitate for some direction. We don't know exactly what that direction is, and we suspect with a portfolio of metrics, there may be conflicting signals about what's good and what's bad, but there will be some level of agitation. That seemed to be a theme in our group. Other groups?
Well, John was in my group, so yes, that was a theme and a topic of discussion. So
there were two other themes. The first one was, well, if you observe it, you measure it, it will change, right? And there were a couple of examples: insurance costs, the transfer of partners, client retention were three areas that were discussed in several groups as plausible of changing when you observe. The second point was that we need to take caution because observing and measuring might undermine the effectiveness of other processes. And there, one of the examples was consultation might be best in an informal basis. If we're measuring consultations, well, people might drive frivolous calls, say to national office or so that was another unintended consequence that the folks mentioned. The third one is if we take it too far, whatever that exactly means, there might be some issuers that might not be able to find an auditor at all. That was a theme that was in at least one or two groups mentioned.
Yeah, I know one of the things, a comment made by Roman was what you measure will affect behavior. So I think that's exactly on point with what we're talking about. And I think that, part of the discussion that flowed from that was maybe you want to affect behavior, but be careful of the unintended consequences. So I think that was a general theme within our group.
Brian Croteau?
Thanks very much. I just, in looking at the data that you have here, I noticed that one of them that didn't show up is the metrics related to independence, testing, and compliance. And it did show up as one of the more controversial. I was a little surprised it didn't show up in the top 15, perhaps, although it's not also in the bottom 15, so maybe you'll tell me it would have been number 16. But I was just curious, given it was one of the more controversial, if anyone in the room had any feedback on why that one would be controversial or why that one wouldn't perhaps be one that would have made it to the top 15.
Do the moderators have a point of view on that? And if not, maybe I could ask those who felt strongly about that one way and the other to articulate their view. But George, did you have a...
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it may just have not been top 15 or bottom 15, so there's possibility that some could have had a wide dispersion, but yet not been in the top or bottom 15. But I can follow up on that, Brian.
Those who thought that metrics related to independence compliance were important. Does someone want to stand up for that view? Denny, were you responding to that, or did you were going to talk to another point? Okay. Anyone want to make the argument for that?
Greg, we felt, or I felt it was important, but perhaps, maybe I understand why it didn't make the top 15, is maybe there was a sense that that's a given, right? That it's assumed. And, there were others that maybe were not, and therefore should be ahead of it. I certainly felt it was important.
Steve, are you going to argue, make the counter argument?
Well, I'll just add a couple points. One is I think that, it can be interpreted many ways, because most independence infractions probably are minor ones where someone, staff level, for instance, owns a security which is a prescribed holding because it's a client of the firm, or they're in the chain of command or something and weren't aware of it. So I think most of the transgressions are small, so just having an absolute criteria of violations is problematic. I think if they had a criteria that said the number of violations that resulted in a determination that the firm was not independent, maybe a threshold which might be more appropriate and understandable.
Okay, that's all I was thinking on independence. We have other cards up on different topics. Independence point?
Yes.
No? Yes.
Yeah, I think I was one of the people who was urging that it be a consideration. And if you go to the New York City policing philosophy, which was you're trying to prevent major crimes, but if you're careful about noticing who's jumping the turnstiles at the subway and track those people and keep an eye on them, it might tell you something in terms of better police protection. And so if someone is not careful and cautious and taking seriously their obligations to comply with the independence rules, and I'm not saying, one, because their spouse has a mutual fund and they didn't realize that it was an issue, but if you have people who are not carefully being certain and trying their best to comply, that might be indicative of a broader problem. And so you might want to track that, and hopefully the firms may be doing that, where you track people who aren't as conscientious about following the independence rules. Maybe that's an indication of a broader problem, and they're not as careful about collecting sufficient competent evidential matter to support their audit opinion. And so you might see a correlation between folks who are less than careful with regard to independence compliance and less than careful in performing audits.
Greg, I would just echo that comment on independence, and I'm not sure how you couldn't incorporate independence evaluation in an audit quality assessment. I'm not sure how you could leave it out. It would be, pretty integral, I would think, to audit quality.
Okay, Danny Beresford?
I don't know that this is related to audit quality indicators as an unintended consequence, but I hear fairly frequently from some of the senior partners at accounting firms that a disturbing number of bright younger partners are leaving the profession because of the pressures that they feel are being imposed upon them as a result of the inspection program, because of the increasing pressures that they feel are being put upon them by being second-guessed through the various process. This seems like it has the potential of adding to that burden. And I just wonder to what extent that is something that the PCAOB takes into consideration in its thought process. I know you're not going to pull your punches, if I can put it that way, but at the same time, there has to be some concern about driving the best and the brightest out of the profession if that is the result that's taking place. I'd be interested in knowing if from the firms, if what I'm hearing is anecdotally not just a few examples, or if it's happening in large numbers.
Yeah, Mike?
So clearly there is a level of anxiety, no question about that, Denny. Is it showing up in turnover? The answer is no. We have not seen a spike in the turnover. We think it's been manageable. One could argue is because the economy is tough, but we have found that the anxiety is manageable. We're not losing people in any spike or any large numbers.
Can I respond to that? Or can I offer
Elizabeth?
a comment? Just that, I've never heard of investors complaining about the audit fees or the being too high. I've heard them complain about them being too low, just in terms of audit quality. Maybe there needs to be a look at compensation if there is going to be more demand on audit quality or more of a focus on, and we have that more of a discussion about it. And that I was surprised to see the compensation aspect, I think, controversial on here. Did it rank in the top in terms of compensation, relative to for the quality of the audit?
Elizabeth, it's your first. It's your first meeting here, but it's interesting. It's a consistent theme that we've heard over the years from investor representatives at the SAG meeting that they hear that audit firms are under a lot of pressure with respect to fees, and the investors consistently say at this meeting, and it's fun. And as I said, it's interesting that it's your first meeting at it, that we're not putting pressure on fees. We want to see high quality auditing. That's what we want most. And so it's an interesting anomaly that the audit is for the investors and the investors are not expressing that concern, but yet we understand that there's fee pressure. So an interesting observation.
Steve?
Yeah, so I was just looking at the top 15 rank page, and it was interesting to me. First of all, it's a very small sample. So I'd encourage you to further vet this, because if you look at the numbers, the academics, you could back into the number of people who voted. It looks like 3 academics and 5 audit committee and 8 auditor, and I'm not smart enough to figure out the number of investor advocates there were, but and 4 issuers, somewhere around there. So a broader sample would be good. But what I found was interesting, though, in looking at the numbers is looking at the number of times that each thought leader category voted the highest or the lowest. So the auditors and the academics were the hardest graders. And I understand why the auditors were not necessarily positively inclined towards some, and I can only assume the academics use a forced distribution to get their numbers. But the investors and audit committee members actually were very favorably inclined, and the audit committee in particular voted the highest rating by far of any of the categories. So I think it's very positive that the audit committee members thought these had value and were so positively inclined toward the attributes.
Bob, follow-on comment?
Yeah. 2 follow-up comments. One regarding fees. It's kind of interesting. It goes back again to the outreach. This has got to be a topic of discussion, because in my audit committees, there is a difference between the level of understanding of what's happening at the audit committee level, even versus senior management. Again, senior management's driving the operations and watching costs, all costs. We're trying to manage risks at the audit committee level. So in the grand scheme of things, I have no problem with increase in fees if we're getting better audit quality and value. So again, I would keep focus on that message as you all do the outreach, because I think it's really important. In between is the firm. They're caught in the middle here. The second is going back to what Denny's comment was, because I've also picked up on that. And it's almost the analogy of employed versus unemployed out there in statistics. I'm not sure how you measure the senior managers observing inspection and what, quote, the partner's going through, and therefore they don't want to be a partner. So again, I think inspection has to be very firm in what we're trying to drive on audit quality, but it's the transparency of inspection and the communication of that that really drives behavior in the trenches. So I'm just asking you to look at that. Thank you.
Bob, let me ask a follow-on question on this. We've looked at some data that suggests that when companies change auditors, audit fees fall by on average 12%. Do you think that if audit committees received a portfolio of metrics along the lines of, say, the top 15, do you think that that would alter an audit committee decision about fees? Would it change the debate at the audit committee level or not?
Well, I can only answer that in my experience on both sides of the fence. But I think if you lead with quality of service and communication, the fee issue becomes very minimal in the conversation and decision process, or it should be anyway, because I think that people are willing to pay for outstanding quality and communication. And I just think we all have to be messaging that, because I think the firms are caught in between right now, and I really don't want to see quality go backwards.
Denny has a follow-up point.
I would say, to respond to your question, that certainly not all, but of the top 15, that looking quickly at them, probably half of them are the types of things that the audit committee would be looking at in terms of the things that would be considered in a proposal process right now. We certainly wouldn't be looking at specific numbers of hours and things like that, but we would be interested in inspection findings if we realize that there had been a lot of negative findings against the firms and so forth, and we certainly look at industry expertise and things of that nature. So many of these things would be exactly the kinds of things that the audit committee would be interested in now, and if something like this was available, quite possibly others would be on the list going forward.
Thank you. Scott Showalter.
Yes, in the interest of, again, stating an obvious fact, following up on John's, is one thing that may create some of the controversy or standard deviation you saw was, when you looked at some of these, was could you actually come up with a measure? I know you're looking for whether the dog hunts to begin with, depending on whether they hunt or not, depends on whether you can come up with a measure as well. For example, if you look at 9, 14, and 15, you're assuming you can come up with what a good utilization percentage is, what is an indication of a good investment, and how many hours should we get. And so sometimes in the room, the discussion was around whether could you even come up with something that would, so that may have an indication on why you got diversity. I just want to point that out, because that was in the room. Sometimes people say, well, I just don't think you can come up with an item that would be meaningful in that case. I just, you ought to think about that in some of your deviations here, on whether the nature of what you are measuring. There's an assumption here on the findings that if you have one finding or more, it's bad. Well, I don't think this is a zero defect game we're in here. So what is the acceptable level of findings that you can have before it goes? So you may want to keep that in mind as you're evaluating these criteria, because I think in a lot of people's minds, it depends on what that you're able to come up with the number. And that'll be part of your research probably to figure that out.
We've had some dialogue with some thoughtful folks recently who feared that one outcome of this effort could be a benchmarking in certain metrics by, say, the PCAOB, who would argue that, say, I'm making this up, but a staff to partner leverage of 10 to 1, anything north of that would be deemed problematic, and they thought that benchmarking by the regulator would be a severe mistake. Speaking for myself, I know of no part of our effort that would try to go to benchmarking. I think our philosophy is let's get meaningful data to relevant people and let them use it to help ensure quality rather than benchmarking. Scott?
I understand that, but we just had a session on reaching out to audit committees. If you don't think audit committees are going to follow up with a question, what's the good number? That's kind of unrealistic. So there's going to be some good follow-on, maybe a lot of good academic research along the way that'll be conducted in this area. But I think I know that's not where you want to go, but it will become a very natural part of the conversation.
Rick?
First of all, I think a great deal of value came out of this exercise, and particularly the massaging of data last night. I find this much more enlightening than in looking at the pre-meeting materials I anticipated I would, so congratulations. Quick observation on benchmarking. I don't understand how you can avoid it. If someone is expected to apply a consistent AQI from company to company on an issue as clear as the one you mentioned, the partner-staff ratio, either you're telling them make up your own benchmark and rate against it, or find out what is the typical average or the PCAOB's view. And it does seem to me that benchmarking is an almost inescapable consequence of many of these. The other comment, or more briefly, is I assume that in order to plan for success, if we're going to pursue this AQI concept, it is terribly important that in its early phases it be seen to be a success. One of the success criteria would be a relative absence of controversy, a list that generally is understood by all of the constituencies to be appropriate. And this discussion today has illustrated that there are some issues on which there are strong feelings. They aren't necessarily new, but to embody them into an AQI is to establish them as a debating center that will put the board and the AQI process into a more controversial light than I think is your intent, which is to try to gain congruency of view for consistent measurement and for motivating behavior.
And Rick, would the implication of your observation be then that you would advise us to start with a small group of metrics that have wide support, and we can add to them over time, but start with consensus type metrics first? Could I imply that from your comment, or?
Absolutely. when you get through eliminating the things that would either be controversial, too substantive, too subjective, too context-oriented, too likely to produce adverse unintended consequences, if what remains is 5 or 10, in the context of a startup process, I think that is far preferable than having 20 of which half will suddenly become the center of a new set of controversies surrounding the process.
Thank you. Galen Hansen.
I happen to agree with Rick's comments on this. I think it's not the quantity, but just stepping back and an observation. I think the only reason to do this is to raise the bar for audit quality. And I happen to believe that audit quality has increased. That bar is higher today than it was 10 years ago. I think it's improved, but it's almost inevitable that what you're doing is going to be viewed as a benchmarking exercise. We were told way back when the inspection started that they shouldn't be viewed as necessarily as a scorecard, but I can tell you they are used as a scorecard right now today. So the inspections themselves are a manner of benchmarking, and you know, it's just simply an observation. I'm not against this at all. I support this effort and moving forward with it, but those unintended consequences, I think, that Rick was getting at are very important to keep your eye on.
Elizabeth Mooney?
Yeah, I'm a lot more positive, I think, on this than the focus on the unintended consequences. I think that this is a really great effort. I think it'll be informative. I think we're going to have a lot more good quality information than the negative. And I think I would encourage you to start with a broader sample. I think it's a lot easier to remove than it is to go back, reopen, and add. So I think you should try a lot more than you might be comfortable with or receive feedback on, and then go from there. I think this is going to be a great project and not a big negative.
All right. Let me just observe two things. One is we got out of this meeting exactly what we had hoped we would. We wanted you to help us differentiate these metrics. You've done that. We wanted your insight as to why some of these seemed to work in your mind and others did not. We wanted your insight as to where we needed to focus our time. I think all of that will help us greatly as we move forward. I also, personally speaking, am encouraged by your enthusiasm for what this project could be, provided that we're diligent and careful with what we're doing. I sense a general sentiment that this is worth making a hard run at this, and I can assure you that we will. And then finally, I would just like to thank my colleagues in Aura, particularly George Wilford and Chris Vanover, who carried much of the water for us on this, but also my colleagues in the other divisions. Each division in the board has helped in a big way, and I sincerely appreciate the efforts, as well as board members are not uninterested in this project, as you might imagine, and have offered thoughtful suggestions and help along the way. So thank you very much, and Marty, back to you.
Thanks, Greg. I thought that was a great discussion, and I agree. Just like every other session we've had on outreach with audit committees, discussion on the standard setting agenda yesterday, the discussion on input with respect to the board's general reports and audit quality indicators, the SAG has certainly exceeded our expectations in terms of valuable content, in terms of things for us to think about. So I think it was a great meeting in terms of what you've given to us. So I thank you for that. The next meeting of the SAG should be on your calendars. We think we posted it a while ago. It's November 13th and 14th. Between now and then, I'll communicate with you at least twice, and you should feel free to communicate with us as often as you like about anything you're seeing, observing, and want to tell us. And I encourage you to do that. But shortly after this meeting, I'll send out a message to all of you and ask for your feedback and input with respect to this meeting, its content, structure, subjects, and things of that nature, and any other views you might want to share about this meeting. And you can also take the opportunity to talk about things you'd like to see on the next meeting agenda or upcoming meeting agendas. And then again, I'll probably do that shortly before the November 13th, 14th meeting, when things are a little down the road a bit, to see if there are other things that you want to make sure we could discuss at the next meeting. Receiving input from you about what should be on these agendas is very valuable to us, so that we're responding to, we're getting input on things we need, but we're also listening to you about important subjects that you think we should be talking about. So again, I will do that a couple of times. I'd also like to just remind folks that we have a couple of proposals out, one on the framework for the standard setting, for standards, and another one on a reproposal on a related party transactions, significant and usual transactions, and we're looking for comment letters with respect to those. So I'd love to hear from all of you with respect to those standards and the framework. We'll be having other ones, as I mentioned. We expect to roll out a few other proposals in the next couple of months, and again, we'll be looking forward to you seeing them. We'll make sure you they'll get into your hands, and we'll look for your comments and observations. With that, we have nothing else on our agenda today, and it's about noon, and we wish you safe travels, and thank you very much for your participation in this meeting. Thanks again.